Good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Um, I just want to test just before we get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent.
We're getting it. Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, good. So we did a sound check earlier, which to be honest, we normally do a sound check. But yesterday, I'd obviously got the mic turned down, and we were obviously just, cruising. And anyway, we obviously needed to up the sound, up the audio input. I believe that the technical term is, and hopefully we're okay today. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all well and looking forward to doing some more, another session on the beginner's guide to DaVinci Resolve 17. We had a bit of a bit of a tough day yesterday, and I'll kind of be honest. It was tough all round. We do an awful lot on the second day. Unfortunately, it can't be helped because we've got so much material that we obviously need to get through that at some point we're going to get a little bit overloaded at some point. But hopefully, you found it all useful. And if there is anything that you weren't entirely clear about, remember everything is covered in the book anyway. We're just trying to show you the practical applications of that, as well as the stuff that's written down. So hopefully we didn't kind of overburden you too much towards the end of the session. But I appreciate sometimes it gets too much. I appreciate that. Today, though, we've got a very straightforward day. And we're actually going to just be spending the entire session in the color page. So more on that in a second. Sherwin and Diego there. So again, you guys know by now, any questions, any worries or concerns or anything like that, or if you're just looking for a bit of advice, I suppose, ideally to do with DaVinci Resolve. I don't think either Sherwin or Diego are qualified to offer maybe psychological or personal advice in that capacity. But certainly, if you've got any questions about DaVinci Resolve, then drop them in the Q&A. And we shall address them all in good time. I don't think we've got any other business to address before we kick in, so we might as well start as we mean to go on. So today, as I said earlier, we are in session 3 of our introduction to the beginner's guide to Resolve. And we are going to be talking about the color page. So we're looking to do 3 lessons today. We're going to start with lesson 9, and then obviously 10 and 11. Yeah, surprise. And we're looking at 3 main subjects here. So the first is just a general introduction to working with the controls in the color page, understanding how we can manipulate images in lots of sort of different ways, but essentially going for the same result. So we're just sort of familiarizing you with the tools there. Along the way, we will also be discussing about DaVinci Resolve color management system as well. So that always is a good discussion to have. After the break, we will actually be taking a look at lesson 10, which is secondary corrections. And then finally, we have a couple of little exercises in lesson 11, which is where we have a bit of fun. And we've got some custom looks, but also working with LUTs as well. So a number of you may have some custom LUTs that you want to work with and use to the best of your ability. So I'll show you how you can use those with DaVinci Resolve. And just before we get stuck into the first lesson, one of the things is probably worth mentioning is, of course, that DaVinci Resolve, this is where it started from. DaVinci Resolve is a color grading application that has editing, visual effects, and audio mixing capabilities. But it's, this is what it's known for, and is actually probably how it's most widely used in the industry as well. So a number of Hollywood feature films, obviously you're probably familiar with, have used Resolve in terms of a finishing tool. So it's got some really high-end tools that we can use. As always, though, I'm using the free version of Resolve for what we're doing in this class. So again, it shows you the power of the free version of the software. So our first lesson today is balancing color and brightness, otherwise known as primary corrections. So again, just for reference, this is lesson 9 in your book. So we're up to lesson 9 already. We're going to be spending a little bit of time. We're going to be looking at the color page interface, because apart from on the first day when we took a trip into the media page, we haven't really been out of the edit page at all. So hopefully you're all feeling pretty comfortable and confident with the edit page and how the interface of DaVinci Resolve works. So hopefully making a trip into the color page now, everyone will feel comfortable for that. But I'm going to walk you through various elements of it as well. We'll be talking about being able to evaluate images and also understanding the video scopes that we've got available to us, and how we can actually use those to actually understand exactly what's happening to our images. We will be doing a series of corrections, so you can sort of follow along and actually sort of see the results happening before your eyes as well. But we will be doing what we call primary corrections. So this is pretty much targeting the entire image. We target very different tonal areas of the image, but we'll get into that more in a little bit. But generally, we're affecting the overall image. So that's what we mean by primary correction. We'll be discussing Resolve's color management system, which has changed for Resolve 17, actually changed for the better. I think it's much more refined, much more nuanced. But we'll also be looking at making a number of adjustments using different sorts of controls. So we'll be using things like the color wheels, the primary wheels. We'll also be making curve adjustments as well, and looking at how each of those controls allows us to do something different or approach the image in a slightly different way. But of course, it's not just about correcting single images. We are, of course, working with a moving image medium. So one of the things that we'll also look at towards the end of this lesson is actually how you manage those grades and those corrections across multiple clips. So obviously it might be that you've got a clip next to another clip and you need to match them, or maybe you've got one clip and you need to be able to apply the same sort of grade with a little bit of a tweak to another shot. So there's quite a bit that we need to think about when we talk about copying corrections and saving and applying grades as well. To start with, though, we are actually going to bid farewell to Age of Airplanes. I know it pains me as well. I can probably hear the, oh no, we want more airplanes. But we're actually going to use some more footage for this section of the class. So we've actually got a DaVinci Resolve archive that's been set up for us. Now remember, the archive actually contains not only the project file needed by DaVinci Resolve, but it also contains the media as well. So it's all bundled together. And the advantage of restoring an archive, which is what we did with the glass blowing exercise previously, is that we don't need to manually relink the files like we had to do with the Age of Airplanes project when we restored that, when we imported that yesterday. So we don't need to do the relink. So an archive is better in this regard. So I've already launched DaVinci Resolve. I've got him open on my computer, and of course I'm looking at the project manager as the starting point. Hopefully you're in a similar position if you're following along with me. And to restore an archive, of course, we just simply right click in an empty space and we just choose the option there from the menu, Restore Project Archive. Restore Project Archive. Now, unsurprisingly, we need to go directly to our Beginner's Guide Lessons folder. So again, I've jumped straight to my desktop. Again, hopefully by now you know exactly where your Beginner's Guide lessons are. So we need to dive into that folder. Remember, we're on lesson 9 today. Open that up, and there you'll see a folder, Wyoming Cattle Ranch.dra. So the DRA extension It's always a bit strange to see it on a folder, but the DRA extension actually means that there's files in there. There's a project file and media files that we're going to use. So we're going to select that and we're going to choose Open. And that will import the project into your project manager. And you should see a new project here, Wyoming Cattle Ranch. Again, it depends what the thumbnail is. The thumbnail doesn't matter too much, but that's the project that you're looking for. And then if you could just simply double click to open that up into Resolve. And you'll see everything is online, all of the footage is in the timeline. That's all very well and good. Let's give everyone a moment just to get sorted on that. Okay, so whilst everyone's getting organized and things, obviously we're going to go straight to the color page. Just before we do, it's just probably worth just spending a moment in the edit page, just so that we can just get our navigation sorted with this project. So I'm just going to go to the workspace menu, choose Reset UI Layout, because again, you know, I was working on all this stuff with audio and pictures yesterday. I've got my audio meters open and I don't really need those. So I'm just going to reset the UI layout, which, by the way, doesn't just reset the layout for this page, it actually resets it across the application as well. So it is also useful to do that occasionally. And just to let you know, we've got a section of media, and you'll notice that there's actually sort of different sorts of media. That there's a bin for 701 clips, there's a bin for log clips, and we'll get onto that in a little while. We've also got a bin of timelines, and we've actually got 4 timelines in this project. So each of those timelines we will actually need for different parts of the lessons as we start to work through it. By default, you should have a timeline open called HD timeline, which you can just double check by having a look in the top of the timeline viewer. And of course, you should have 4 clips in your timeline. It is a slightly uninspiring edit, but these are just our starting points. Okay. So a traditional workflow, if you are familiar with sort of color grading, would be to have the editors cut together the program or the film inside a nonlinear editing system. You then send out some sort of information to get from the editing system into the grading application, which could be DaVinci Resolve, could be something else. Don't see why people would want to use anything else, but there you go. And what you have to do is you then have to conform the project. And what that means is it's a very time-consuming task, or can be a time-consuming task, depending on the complexity of the edit. But you need to make sure that everything comes across 100%, and sometimes you need to go through and you need to start changing things so that they match the edit, because not everything has come across from the edit system. And quite often we use things like XML files, EDLs back in the day, and that sort of thing. But with DaVinci Resolve, of course, we've got the color grading application sits right next to our editing application. So in order to go for a color grade, all we need to do is move into the color page. It's as simple as that. So I've got my HD timeline open. All we're going to do is go straight down to the bottom of the interface and choose the color page. There's also a keyboard shortcut for this as well. So you've also got keyboard shortcuts for the media, which is actually Shift 2, edit is Shift 4, color is Shift 6, and I'll let you work out the others. But you've got keyboard shortcuts for jumping between them as well. By the way, if you're working on a slightly reduced screen size, so if you're maybe working on a laptop, you may find that you don't actually have the names of the pages down at the bottom. It might be, if I just simply right click here, you might just have the icons only. So if you do just see the icons, it is a bit of a space saving a space-saving thing, rather than the fact that you're missing something there. But the icons will be the same. As you can see, I can move over them and it will tell me what each of those pages are. So I'll just bring up the icons and labels again. Okay, so what are we looking at in terms of the color page? Well, the color page is actually divided into sort of 3 horizontal areas. So the first part at the top actually mainly contains the viewer, of course. We've also got a stills gallery here on the left. We've also got access to other things that we can open up in this area as well. So you can see we've got the gallery, we've got a LUTs browser, which we'll look at later, so we don't need to be too worried about it at the moment. And we've also got access directly to the media pool if we need it. But generally, we want to grade material that's already in the timeline, so we don't necessarily need to be too worried about going back to the media pool and the color page. On the right-hand side of the viewer here, you've actually got your node tree. And when we work with grades in the color page, we don't layer them up like we would do with effects in the edit page, for example. We actually break them apart into a node structure, which actually allows us to kind of do some quite clever things with the color grading process. So rather than relying on that layer-based approach to applying effects that you might find in something like Premiere Pro or Avid or something like that, by breaking it down into nodes, it makes it much more flexible and much more powerful in terms of what we can do and how we can sort of separate the processes out. So we will talk about the sorts of nodes that we've got, and we've got quite a few nodes that we can choose from, but we're really only going to concentrate on 2 types of nodes in this class. If you want to look at some of the other nodes that are available and practical aspects of applying those, then of course we've got the colorist guide to resolve as well. So this is of course just the primer for that. So that's what we have along the top of the interface here. In the center, we've got 2 means of being able to view and review the timeline. The first is the clips panel here. And you can see here I've got clips at the top as an option. So if you don't see any of these, if I click on the clips window here, you can see that I can hide and show that just by simply clicking on it. The clips actually shows us the thumbnails, the first frame of each of those separate clips in the timeline. And they're also labeled consecutively. So you see we've got clip 1, 2, 3, 4 in the order that they appear in the timeline. So we know that this is clip 1, we know that this is the last clip. Also, we've got time code information about that clip, but underneath there, you can actually see we've also got the codec of the clip. So in this case, you can see that all of this footage is Apple ProRes 422 HQ. So all sort of standard HD formats here. If you double click where it says Apple ProRes 422 HQ for any of those clips, it will actually give you the file name of the clip. If you double click again, now it comes up blank here, but this will actually show you a version. And a version means that you can actually choose different options. You can try things out. It's not something that we're going to get into in this class, but again, in the colorist guide, there's much more information on that. But if we double click again, we go back to the codec. We can access clips just by simply clicking on them here in the clips window. And what that does is it actually takes us to the first frame of that clip in the timeline. So you can see here in the viewer, I am looking at the first frame of that clip. I've got a scrubber bar here in the viewer, so I can actually scrub through the clip. And my JK and L keys work just the same way, so I can actually play through the clip both forward and backwards.
I love being outdoors.
And you can also hear the audio, of course. Now, I don't really need to worry about the audio with this. I'm more interested in the pictures. So I'm actually just going to mute the audio completely from my system, just so that it's not going to distract us too much. But you can see I can just play from that clip, and then I will just move directly onto the next clip, for example. And again, I can just jog back here using the J, K, and L keys there. I'll bring up my keyboard shortcut so you can see what I'm doing. As well as that, you've also got a loop option, which is useful sometimes to have turned on. So in this case, it will actually just simply loop that clip when I reach the end. And again, quite useful because you want to be able to see how a grade affects the whole shot. So so that's another thing that we can turn on and off there. Below the clips window, you've got your timeline. And it's just like a sort of miniaturized timeline. It will actually just show you the video tracks within your timeline. If you've got multiple tracks of video, you will have multiple tracks in your timeline, and you'll see V1, V2, V3, for example. So it's like a mini representation of the timeline in that window. Again, you can turn this on and off using the timeline button here. But again, there's a minimal space saving there. But you do have a playhead, you'll notice. And as I move the playhead through the timeline, you can actually see it will automatically select the clip underneath the playhead. And the appropriate clip is also highlighted in the clips window. So you've got a few options for actually navigating the timeline. You could either do it the old-fashioned way, if you like, move a playhead back and forth, or you could just simply click on the thumbnails. Sort of each person that I know, it just sort of has their own particular way of being able to navigate around the project in this case. For me, I often like clicking on the thumbnails, particularly, you know, they're labeled so you can easily see which thumbnail you're clicking on. And down at the bottom, underneath the timeline, we actually have the nuts and bolts of the color page. And what this is it's basically the different controls that you've got. So at the moment, you can see that I've got what we call 3 palettes of controls, and there's an arrangement here of these buttons along the top. So here on the left palette, I'm currently looking at my color wheels, and that tends to be the sort of the most familiar set of controls if you've been doing any sort of color work inside other nonlinear editors. Mainly they tend to use color wheels, not always, but generally. So that's what I'm looking at here. But I've actually got a whole set of other controls here, for example. So here I can actually click on this. This is my RGB mixer. And again, this left-hand set of controls actually changes as well. We're really only interested in the primaries in these color wheels here. So this is the control that we're actually going to use mostly in this class.
Hey, Chris, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, mate.
Could you explain why some people may be seeing 3 panels instead of 2, unless you're already going to do that?
I was going to do that, but yeah, we can do that now. Not a problem at all. But just to show people as well, here in the center, I've actually got my middle set of controls here. So this includes my color curves. Sorry, I've also got power windows, tracker, and so on and so forth. Now, just as Sherwin says, and by the sounds of it, people have been asking the same question. You may not see 3 sets of controls like I've got three separate areas of the interface down at the bottom. It purely depends on your screen resolution. So I'm working on a 1920 by 1080 display here so that I can stream to you. It's a little small, it's a little cramped for what I'm normally used to. But if you're working particularly on a laptop, what you will find is that this middle set of controls here will actually be grouped with this first set of controls here. So hopefully that makes sense. So here you'll see here on the left, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of controls. ending with motion effects. Then I've got a gap before I have my curves. What you will be seeing, if you've only got two sets of two areas of control, what you'll be seeing is those curves will actually follow directly on from the end of this one here. And it just means that the curves are actually then grouped with that first set of controls. So in this case, you would click on the primaries here. That would give you the color wheels that we were talking about. But then if you click on the curves button here, and again, remember, this will be over here in your interface if you're working with a much reduced resolution. If you click on those, you will see that set of controls appear. So effectively, this middle set of controls is actually docked with the first set of controls. And what I'll do is, as I'm moving between the different controls, I'll tell you where I am, and I'll point out the button that you need to click in order to be accessing those controls. So hopefully that makes sense on that. The other part of the interface that we have is over here on the right-hand side. And actually, currently, it shows me my keyframe panel. But more importantly, what I need to look at is the scopes. So this is the other thing that we're going to change now. Over here on the right-hand side, above that keyframe panel, and again, if you're working on a reduced display, this keyframe panel will be much bigger on your display than it will be on mine. It usually takes up around about sort of 2/3 of this, this width here. But you've got three buttons there. You've got your keyframes, and the keyframes would be used if you need to manipulate a grade over time. So for example, the cameraman tweaks the exposure, for example. We're not going to do that today, but the middle control here is your scopes. And then you've also got your info panel there, but we're interested in scopes. So click on this sort of like little wiggly line symbol here, and that will display the video scopes. There are 4 scopes inside DaVinci Resolve. I was going to say 4 scopes. There's actually another one that I've completely forgotten about. So there are 5 scopes within Resolve. So here at the moment, I'm in something called the Parade scope. And if you click this little downward arrow here, you can actually see, you actually gain access to all of the other scopes here. So the Parade scope is the one I've got selected here. But if I just click on this one here, this is the waveform. The waveform, and it's probably one of the most familiar scopes to most people who work in video. Resolve actually measures the brightness of an image and the contrast of an image based on the waveform here, which goes from 0 all the way up to 1023. Because this is actually measuring the brightness of the image as a 10-bit video signal. Don't worry too much about the numbers. The numbers aren't necessarily that important just at the moment. Just think of 0 as being no brightness. No brightness just means black. And just think of 1023 as being full brightness or white. So what we have here is we actually have a measurement of the brightness of the different pixels across the image in our viewer. Thank you, Diego, for highlighting the scopes button for me. The scopes button is here. You can actually see inside the scopes there's there are these indicators. These are called traces that are actually different colors. So you can see I've got red, I've got green, and I've got blue traces. Another scope that we've got here is the Parade scope. And this actually is doing a similar sort of job of the waveform, but it actually separates out the individual red, green, and blue color channels into separate columns within the scope, just so that you can see the balance of the actual image. And to be absolutely honest, I find that this is probably my favorite scope personally. I tend to find this is the one I use, particularly in this set up in this interface where I can only see one scope at a time. If we click in the menu again, the other scope that we've got is the vector scope. The vector scope measures the hue, the actual color, if you like, within different parts of the image, but also about the intensity of that color, or what we would call saturation. And in this case, the center of this is 0 saturation or no color. And then these various targets are the maximum values for example, yellow, red, magenta, blue, cyan, and green. If you go to the histogram, if you maybe have done some work with photography applications before and things like that, you may be familiar with the histogram. I personally don't use it, but we do have a histogram. It's effectively measured. It's just simply displaying the same information in a different way. And of course, we have this chromaticity thing as well, which we won't go near just for the moment, so don't worry about that. But usually it's the waveform or the parade is a good starting point for this. So I'm just going to go back to my parade. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll go for the waveform because it's easier just to reference a single scope just at the moment. You can actually use this button here in order to be able to pull the scopes out into a separate floating window here. The advantage of this is you can then actually arrange the scopes how you want them. So here at the top, you've got various arrangements of multiple panels for each of the scopes, and then you can go into those and you can choose individual scopes depending on what you prefer to see. So sometimes it's useful to see multiple scopes at the same time when you're actually doing your color grading. Obviously, you would need a separate panel for this. That's a separate monitor for this, really, because you can't work with that overlapping everything else. So I'm actually just going to close that down by clicking on the X in the top left, just to go back down into this bottom right-hand corner. Okay. All right. So I think we're just about there. That covers most of the color page. So what we're doing when we are using the color page is we're trying to do probably one or two tasks. The first one is what we're trying to do is actually to create what we call a balanced image. And a balanced image is actually, the most sort of pleasing image, just sort of correcting some of the problems that you get when you're shooting footage. I mean, the most common problem is things like exposure, and you're trying to, if you're on location, you're trying your best to expose for the appropriate shot. And sometimes it's not always perfectly possible to get it right. So usually some sort of tweak to the exposure is needed. And the other problem that many people encounter, of course, is things like white balance problems. So usually what we're trying to do is, hate to use the word correct the image, but what we're trying to do is correct to make the footage as best as possible. Usually a nice sort of bright, well-balanced shot is very pleasing. But once we've got a balanced shot, then what we can do is we can then start to treat it in a creative way. And that's the grading side of things. So once you've got a balanced shot, what you can then do is you can then sort of twist it off in a particular creative way in order to create, for example, maybe something like a Saving Private Ryan look or that sort of thing. But the best thing to do, first of all, is actually to balance the shot to get the very best out of it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use this timeline here just to explore some of the controls that we've got in terms of familiarizing you with the process of grading in the color page. So to begin with, what I'd like you to do is just select clip 1 in your clips window. That of course takes us to the first frame of the clip in the timeline, it's always good practice to actually just scrub through the clip just to have a quick look, and hopefully you would be able to watch the timeline and see the sorts of things that you will be up against at some point. But it's always good practice to scrub through the clip just in case there's anything in there that might just sort of kind of throw a wrench into the works or something at some point. So maybe maybe the cameraman twitched the exposure or something like that. So, just be aware of if there's anything coming that that would affect your color grade at all there. So first thing to do is, well, we look at the shot and we look at this guy and we think, well, actually, it's okay. It seems, quite a nicely exposed shot. He doesn't look green, for example. He doesn't look ill, or he doesn't look as though he's bright red or anything like that. So there's nothing hugely problematic about it. However, if we come down here to the scopes and have a look at the scopes, you'll see there are some of these parts of the scopes that are actually reaching the black point. Now, most shots will have some form of dark black area, because most shots in some way will have some form of shadow. So there's usually going to be something within that shot that should be sitting at the black level. Now you'll also see here the uppermost part of the image here, and this sort of lump of pixels here is actually this sort of bright area around his hat here. You can actually see that sort of sitting at around about that 768 line there. So it's quite bright, but it's not really as bright as a huge bright white light. Yes, because that's not what it's supposed to be. And usually when we're thinking about the brightness of an image, it might be just a little bit more subjective. Unless there's something that's bright white in there, then it's quite sort of difficult to know exactly how bright something should be. So it is a little bit more subjective there. Now here, there are a few little sort of specular highlights on these sort of metal accoutrements for horse riding. And you'll see here in the scopes, there's actually a few little spikes there. They could be very bright, but again, it's minor in terms of this image. So let's have a look at what we can do here. Well, first of all, down in the bottom left-hand corner, just make sure you're in this control here. These are your color wheels. So click on there. Also, just to make mention, we're not really going to use additional controls here, but there are actually 3 dots along the top there that you can actually access different controls, which effectively do a similar sort of thing. Certainly the first 2. So first you've got the wheels, then you've got the bars, and then you've got the log controls. We're not going to touch the log controls or the bars. So just make sure you're actually in the wheels tab. The wheels controls there. You can also switch the controls here using this drop-down menu here to switch between each of those 3 controls. So make sure we're in wheels. And here we've actually got a control called offset. An offset actually allows us to manipulate the entire image. It's one of those controls that's useful to know that is there, because occasionally you do need to do this, but we'll break this down in a little bit more in a few minutes. There are 2 main sets of controls in the color wheel. The first is the actual wheel itself. That controls the hue, the color, and the intensity, the saturation. Below that, you've actually got a horizontal dial, and this actually controls the brightness of the image. So in this case, if we click on this lower control, this is called the master wheel here. If we click on this, and we can move this left and right, and as you do that, you should be able to see that the image is actually changing in terms of its brightness. Notice how the actual scope is moving up and down as well. The whole scope is moving, so that we can see that we can actually adjust the overall brightness of that image, but the actual scope itself is remaining at the same contrast. So I'm just going to find a point just as I just bring most of those little pixels down. I'm only going to lower it down slightly just to darken the shot a little bit. I'll go a little bit further than I would normally do, just to darken that shot down a little bit. So that's how we control the brightness of the image. And the ratio between the dark portions of the image and the brightest portions of the image are known as the contrast ratio. And a pleasing shot normally has a good contrast ratio. So the blacks are usually blacks and the whites are white. Not always, but usually. So that's controlling the brightness of the image. The other thing that we've got is the actual color wheel itself. And if we take a look at this here, you'll notice here we've actually got a sort of a red set of pixels that are slightly higher than the others. And if we sort of look at the image again, we could probably see actually the image does feel quite warm. Yes. So, you know, although it necessarily didn't appear that way initially, it does feel a little bit warm. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to come to this offset control, and I'm going to click in the middle of that control, and I'm just going to pull the control away from the red. So I'm going to pull it towards the cyan area of the color wheel. So I'm going to click and drag it. You don't want to make a big adjustment when you're doing this, small adjustments, and you can see that the red pixels start to move back towards the blue and the green pixels on the scope. Okay, you don't need to go very far at all on this, but what that does is you'll notice in the image it actually cools the image down a little bit. It takes a little bit of that redness away. So now his complexion, his skin tones actually feel a little bit more normal. His hat has lost a little bit of that sort of ruddiness, and we've taken out a little bit of that sort of overall redness, particularly in these leather straps here. Now it's a bit difficult really to see what we've actually achieved here. So the best thing to do is actually to do a comparison, a before and after comparison. And the way that we can do that here is this button at the top here allows us to bypass the color grade. So if you click that, it turns the grade off. And what we're now seeing is we're actually seeing the original shot. Look at the scope, see the difference, look at the image, see now how red that appears. And if you click that button again, you'll turn the grade back on and you can see the adjustment that you've just made. So even these tiny little changes that we've made have actually, made quite a bit of a difference between the original shot, which we thought was okay, or certainly I thought was okay at first glance, and this corrected or adjusted shot. And this means, and I'm really sorry about this, this means that you will never look at your footage in the same light ever again. Every shot will need to be tweaked, even the slightest, and I apologize for that. As well as this, this option here to turn off the grade, just be aware that it also tells me that this is bypassed here. Now this is quite important because what you tend to do is you tend to turn grades on and off quite quickly in order to do a before and after comparison. I'll show you how to do that in a second using a keyboard shortcut. But sometimes you're making minor changes and sometimes you might leave the grade off and you think it's on. So if you then try and change the controls of something and you're not seeing the change visually, just do a quick sanity check. Make sure you haven't bypassed the grade at all, because once you've bypassed it for one clip, it will bypass it for the others as well. So just be careful of that. To turn the grade on and off, to turn the bypass on and off, keyboard shortcut is Shift D. So Shift D to enable or disable the grade. And again, you can see it just gives you that sanity check. That's what I had before, and that's how I've adjusted the image. Okay, so that's one example, a simple example just to get us started. Let's move to clip 2. This is a slightly more challenging shot. Here we've actually got this this lady here. She's sort of sitting in a very darkened room. Looks like it's an interview sort of situation. If we scrub through that, yeah, we can see that she's talking, looking at the camera. But the shot is, well, it just feels really quite, you know, we're not really seeing any part of it. Nothing appears to be bright. It's almost like it was shot, you know, natural light falling through a window, no lights for the camera or anything like that. So goodness knows. But this is sometimes the shots that we dealt with. If we come to the scopes and I take a look at the waveform, you'll notice again those dark areas. Now look at this, we've got this very dark area here. We've got some quite dark areas here, but it's only sort of on the right hand side. It actually reaches that black line, that 0 line. So again, it might be a minor thing, but we could probably just sort of eke a little bit more out of the contrast here. Also, the highlights here at around about the 640 line. This is halfway to our 1023 or just above. So we've got plenty of scope here, if you pardon the pun, plenty of scope here in order to increase the contrast. If we go to the offset control that we've just used and use the master wheel at the bottom in order to be able to increase the brightness of this image, you can see that this gives us, it brightens it up. We see a little bit more detail in the background, but it kind of washes everything out because the contrast ratio is actually so small. When we just simply brighten the shot using the offset, it just moves everything up. All of the pixels are brightened by the same amount. So in this case, the offset isn't going to help us. What we need to do is we actually need to be able to go in and adjust different parts of the image in order to be able to create the best result possible. So to reset the offset, what you can do here is just click on this reset button here, this curly arrow. You'll notice this will actually just reset the entire offset controls here. You'll notice that there is also a reset for the entire panel of control. So this will just reset the entire changes that you've made there. But if I just reset the offset here, this puts the image and it puts the scope back to where we started. So instead of just using the offset, we've actually got 3 individual sets of controls called lift, gamma, and gain. Now, the lift represents the darker portions of the image, the darker pixels. The gain represents the brightest portions of the image. And the gamma represents everything in between. But actually, there's quite a lot of overlap between these controls. So this is why we often call this process color balancing, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to balance one set of controls with the other. And although the lift might be controlling the much darker pixels, actually the sort of the fall off for that can actually go through and affect some of those bright pixels as well, but to a much lesser extent. So there's a lot of overlap between these controls. So to give you an indication as to how we can do this, if we take the master wheel here underneath for the lift, remember these are the darkest parts of the image. If we just sort of take that and just click and drag that to the left, you can see that as I do that, can you see how the scope just starts to move those pixels down, but it's not really moving. Thank you very much, guys. It's not really moving the top part of the waveform there. It's mainly moving the bottom part there. So I'm just going to bring it down just so that those pixels are a little bit more towards that black area. Now, I don't want to go too far here because I don't want to completely crush all of the detail out of the shadows, but I've just brought that down probably around about maybe 1 or 2 points. So each of those. So it's a small change, but you can see how I've actually crushed these blacks and actually made them a lot sort of deeper. So again, Shift D to turn that off, Shift D to turn it back on again. And again, there's no real detail to be lost here, but you need to be quite careful when you're doing this. You don't want to go too far and crush the blacks and lose valuable detail in the shot. Now, we want to go straight to the gain here. So remember, the gain is the brightest parts of the image. And again, we're going to take the master wheel for this, and we're going to click on this and drag to the right. And as we do so, notice how we're actually stretching the contrast. Can you see on the scopes where it's actually stretching the highest, brightest parts of the image? The very blackest pixels are barely being touched, if at all. So this is really stretching the contrast. And you can see now her face, her hat, her scarf has really started to brighten up. Notice how the background, particularly on her right-hand side, my left, as I look at it, I'm starting to see that sort of readiness in the background start to come through. So it's stretching sort of these pixels around here. Now, where I need to put those is a matter for some discussion, but I'm just going to place the round about the sort of the highest point of those pixels, just around about that 896 line. So it's probably about sort of 85–90% all the way to the brightest parts of the image. And this is usually, this is the sort of the hat. So I don't really want the hat to be bright white because it shouldn't be. So now if I press Shift D, I can see where I started and where I am. And now all of a sudden she's got a little bit more color in her cheeks. The scarf has come out, the brightness has been increased. Things are looking much better now. So that means I've got expanded contrast across this shot. You could look at that and say, well, but you know, that's it. That's all I need to do to this. But it's always worth also having a play around with the gamma controls. Now, the gamma is the mid range between the brightest whites and the blackest blacks. But again, there's a lot of overlap here. So it really is worth sort of playing around. It's not quite true to say this, but I often think of the gamma as mainly the exposure. So it's not touching the brightest whites, it's not touching the blackest blacks, but it sort of tweaks the middle range of that. So best thing to do is actually to play around with it. So if I bring the gamma up, for example, see how it's sort of pushing the rest of the pixels up. Notice how it actually brings a little bit more detail out of her jacket on the right hand side there. So usually, and this is a personal thing for me, a lot of the grading that I tend to do is correcting shots and trying to get the very best out of them. And because a lot of what I do tends to be interviews, I tend to like to increase the gamma a little bit. But if I go the other way with the gamma, you can see now I'm really starting to crush the image. I've still got that sort of brightness in the hat and the face and the eyes and the teeth and the scarf. But now I'm starting to create a much more moodier shot just by lowering that gamma down. So it becomes a little bit more of a sort of personal choice as to what you do. And what you may find yourself doing is, as you're adjusting the gamma to get the result that you're after, you may need to come back in and just sort of tweak the gain and the lift a little bit just to get the result that you want. So I've just lowered the gamma down around about 0.07 there, just to give us a little bit more moodiness. And you can tell I've lost a little bit more detail there. And again, with this shot, you know, it kind of looks as though it might be, you know, a nice shot and all nicely color balanced. If we take a look here at these high points here, remember these are in the gain, you'll see that the blue channel is quite high up. So this indicates to me, at least in the highlights in the gain, there's quite a lot of blue. There's also a little bit of green. Blue and green together is a bit more sort of cyan, but more towards the blue side of things. And then there's not really an awful lot of red. And again, if I look at this hat, it just feels a little bit cool, if I'm being honest. So what we can do here with the gain is we can actually push a little bit more red just into the highlight. Not a lot, just a little bit. So I'll push a little bit of red in, and you can see that that pushes that red channel up a little bit more. And again, this is the balance that we were talking about before. You don't need to do a huge amount of this. If I go really far, you can see how it's just warming up that hat. So I don't really need an awful lot in there just to make that hat a little bit more neutral. It's great having these arrows that people are pointing out what I'm doing. Wonderful. So I'm doing one thing with my mouse, and I need you to look at something else. But yes, you can see getting those. Wonderful. Thank you. Oh no, we've started something now, haven't we, guys? Okay, good. So again, Shift D, that's what we started with. That's what I've got. You will have a different result, of course. There's also probably a bit more red in the shadows than I would like as well. That's to do with this sort of wooden background here. So if you wanted to get rid of that, if you go to the lift, again, you can pull a little bit out of the shadows there, and that'll actually just sort of make those shadows nice and black. So you can see that it's actually reduced the red channel there in the lift. Okay, hopefully everyone's keeping up with us and finding this useful. Let's move over to clip 4. Click clip 4. Have a quick scrub through that, just have a look at it. Again, because it's an interview, generally the lighting doesn't change. So you've got something consistent at least throughout that shot. And what we can do here is we look at this shot, and it's the same fella as before. Again, we got quite a bit of shadows in this. We've got this hat again, and we've also got sort of background with a few little specular highlights there. But if we look at the scopes, you can see that pretty much the blacks are black. So this parts of the image here are pretty much black. So we're usually okay with that. We could probably increase the gain a little bit more here. And obviously we've got a little bit more of a red channel in here again. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very quickly correct this, and then I'm just going to give you a moment, a few minutes or so, just to have a go yourself, just to put into practice what we've been talking about. So I'll just talk you through it first of all. Usually we would always start with the lift traditionally, and just to make sure that there's nothing hiding there, I'll just make sure that that sort of sits at the 0 line. Ultimately, there's not a huge amount I need to do with the lift here. I'm going to bring the gain up, but again, I'm going to go with that 896 line. And as soon as I do that, looking at the image, I can really feel the redness in that image there. Let's just try and brighten him up a little bit in the gamma. I quite like that personally. I see a little bit more of his face on the right hand side. However, again, you could go a little bit more moody. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to go a little bit brighter than the default there personally. That usually pushes the gain up, so I just need to be careful I don't get the gain and start to crush the pixels at the top of the scopes, because then it will start to clip the signal. But then again, you can see again with the gain here, I've got that very reddy sort of color color tint there. So I'm going to come to the game, pull a bit of the red out, a bit more blue into it, get that balance nicely. That nicely cleans up here in this background here. So that's all good. Let me just try a little bit in the mids. There's a little bit more red in the mid. Yeah, that's pulling that mid out of the red. Yeah, that's working for me. So gives you an idea. That's where we started. That's where I'm now ending. Actually, looking at it now, it feels a little bit too blue. So I think I've gone a little bit too far there. So I'm going to push a little bit more back into the red there. So that's where we started, and that's where I've taken it. I shall give you a moment or two to have a play around with that. Okay, good. Okay, so that just sort of gives us an idea as to how this could work. But I also want to take this opportunity to show you a couple of other controls that you could use. Just as you've now done that manually yourself, and hopefully you're pleased with the result. And now I'm going to get you to reset it. So at the top of the primaries here, we're going to reset the entire primaries wheels here. So I'm going to click on that, reset it. I'm back to where I started originally. You could also go to the color menu, and you could also choose reset, and then you would choose all grades and nodes. That's another way of doing it. So if you've used another control somewhere else because you're being clever and you know what you're doing, then that's another way of just resetting everything. And the reason for this is I actually just wanted to show you another set of controls that we've got. There's very rarely one way of doing something. And one of the things sometimes is it's quite difficult to know what to do for the best. Sometimes you might try something out and you're not happy with the results. So there's actually a set of automatic controls. Now, I know the colorists amongst you are just shouting at the internet now saying, Chris, what are you talking about? You need to do absolutely everything manually. And they're right, so calm down. However, sometimes it's useful to have a guide. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And so there are actually a couple of controls I want to point out to you here. The first is this black color picker here, and it says next to the lift. So there's a little target, and there's also one for the gain as well. So how do these work? Well, what you are trying to tell Resolve is that the area in which you're going to click on the image is ideally black or white. Okay, so you're saying to Resolve, that pixel that I'm clicking on there, that is black or that is white. And Resolve will do the rest. To show you what I mean, if I click on this target here for the lift, I pick it up, and you don't need to hold your mouse down when you're doing this. You simply pick it up. Can you see next to that picker, you can see it actually shows me the red, green, and blue values. And in this case, I think I'm measuring 8-bit value rather than 10-bit value, because you can see it's actually sets of 3 digits. So here you can see red, green, and blue. Now, if I was actually sat on a black pixel, that should be 0, 0, 0. But it's not. It's actually 2 in the red, 4 in the green, 3 in the blue. So again, it's showing me that actually there's slightly more blue and green than there is red, so slightly bluish sort of color cast in the shadows. So if I find somewhere that I know should be black, and shadows are always a good thing for this, so if I click in the shadow there, what it will try and do is it will try and adjust the image so that that pixel should register as black. And you can see here it's actually adjusted my lift by just taking down the red channel a little bit, which makes sense because where I clicked was actually a different value from what I was talking about originally. If I do the same here with the gain, again, pick up the gain. Now here, again, it depends where I click as to what the result will be. But I want to try and find somewhere that's a little bit neutral, but again, should be a sort of like, you know, in the sort of the white area, you know, so actually should have a little bit of equal amounts of color. And again, you can see here, the red color channel is actually 173. The green is 159 and the blue is 138. So in this case, there's actually a little bit more red in this part of the image than there is green and blue. Hence, we look at the scopes, that's exactly what we've got. So if I click on this, now you can see that actually what it's done is it looks much better, but it looks as though there's a spotlight shining on him, because what it says is that, where you've clicked, that should be as bright as I can get it. But as we talked about, actually, I don't want it that bright, but never fear, because what you can do is you can come to the gain and you can bring that down to a much more sensible brightness level. And can you see how it's actually sort of compressed those red, green, and blue color channels? So it's balanced them out. It's removed the red color cast when it actually brightened the image. So these are useful controls to at least give you some sort of starting point for it. But it does depend on where you click, so do pay attention to the numbers. If you click on a black pixel, you won't see any changes with the lift control because that black pixel is black. You are clicking on something that you need or you want to be black. Okay. Again, there are numerous ways of doing the same thing. Let's click on clip 3. Oh, and you'll notice that as I'm changing these images, you can see how they get a rainbow border around the number. It tells you that shot's been graded. So let's click on clip 3, a similar shot to what we had on clip 2, but now we want to look at sort of different sets of controls for this. And you'll notice at the top of the primary wheels here and along the bottom, there's actually a set of other controls, and these can be useful in terms of making very, very quick changes to the image as well. So first of all, we've got contrast, for example. If I move my mouse over the numbers for this, click and hold and drag left and right, you can actually see I can adjust the contrast of the shot. Notice how it's actually sort of pushing a little bit more a contrast between the bright and the dark points of this. I could probably go too far, and you can actually see I'm really stretching things out now. So I'm going to go to around about, just looking at the image, look at the scope sitting around about 768. There's only so far I can go with this. Around about maybe 1.2, 1.3 maybe. That's what I've gone for, but I wasn't looking at the numbers. I was actually looking at the scope and looking at the image. So that's your contrast, and it sort of stretches it, and generally from the middle. It's a little bit below the middle of the image. You can adjust that with the pivot, but that gives you an idea of the contrast. But of course, it's sort of stretching at equal amounts. If you need to adjust the highlights or the shadows individually, you've actually got shadow and highlight controls down at the bottom. So at the moment, the highlights are probably a little bit low. I just want to bring the highlights up a touch. So I'm going to click on the highlight and just drag that control up a little bit more, just to brighten her face out a little bit and brighten that hat up a bit, probably just below the 896 line. So around about sort of, I'm around about sort of 33.5, but again, don't worry about the number, look at the scope. Again, you've got the shadows as well that you can do. You can change the shadows if you need to. If you need to reset any of these values, just double click the name and that will just reset the value for you. So again, we're getting that nice sort of contrasty shot with the background here. Again, there's a little bit of an issue with the scope here. You can see that we've got a little bit more blue in the image, a little bit less red. So again, that blue-green sort of color cast. So this is making the hat particularly look a little bit cool in this light. Well, if you come here, you've got temperature. And temperature allows you to add warmth to sort of the orange area of the color wheel, or it allows you to add coolness towards the sort of the blue cyan area of the color wheel. You've also got tint for the opposite side, so you've got magenta and green for the other way, but in this case we go for temperature, and what I want to do is I just want to warm it up slightly. So I'm going to click in the temperature, just click, add a little bit, look at the scopes, bring in that blue, green and red channels together. About there, I think, for me. So maybe around about the sort of 350, 390. It's gone quite nice. Might just, yeah, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe around about the 400, I'd have thought. Let's bring that close together. Yeah, I think if you go to around about 500, it starts to take on a little bit more warmth in the image than I'm comfortable with. So I'm just going to back it off to that sort of 380, 390. And again, I've got that very sort of clean sort of tone to the hat there. There are a couple of other things I just want to point out to you in this set of controls as well, because there's lots of little things that you can do. First of all, you've got something called color boost, which is worth mentioning just in passing. What this will do is it will take areas of low saturation within the midtones and it will just boost the saturation in that area. Now, the reason I mention this is because generally skin tones sit within the mids. So here, if we increase the color boost, you can actually see we can put a bit of warmth into her skin tones. Now, I don't want to go too far with this, tiny little bit just to add it, because it will also add it to the background there, as you saw. And the final thing I just want to point out to you here is mid-tone detail. And mid-tone detail, and again, depending on the size of your screen, you may see these abbreviated even more than what I'm seeing here. So mid-tone detail is actually a softening or a sharpening within the midtones. So softening or sharpening. So if I actually reduce the mid-tone detail here, it will actually start to soften her skin tones. Now, I don't want to go too far with this because I don't want to make her look as though, you know, I've got Vaseline over the lips or anything. We don't need to go that far. But just to help, just to sort of soften her midtones a little bit, is quite a useful technique for skin tones and things like that. So that gives you some idea of some of the additional controls that we've got here. Okay, everyone happy? How are we doing? Hopefully we're all
Great, great.
Doing
He
well.
did great.
good, good, good. So what we've done is we've spent a little bit of time getting to know the controls, understanding how we are manipulating the image in order to create a nice balanced shot. We're not going for the creative look, not yet. We're going for the balanced shot. Get it to look right, get it to look consistent across the shots, and you're part way there, most of the way there, I should say. Then you can apply your different looks and LUTs and things like that. But let's go on a step further. Let's go on a step further. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch timelines now. So from the top of your viewer here, you've been working in a HD timeline. Click on that menu at the top and choose Mixed Cameras Timeline. So this is just a quick way of switching between any active sequence within your project. So Mixed Cameras Timeline from the timeline menu at the top of the viewer. Now, this is a much more comprehensive timeline. We've got graphics in there. We've got a range of images as well. If you wanted to go back and watch this in the edit page, I'll let you do that at your convenience. There's no real need for us to do that, but it is showing us a lot more of the Wyoming ranch footage for this project. You will notice that there are a number of clips that you've probably already seen before. So for example, clip 5, you've already seen. Clip 9, you've already seen. Clip 13, you've already seen. Yes, so each one of those has actually been included within this timeline. You will notice that some, but by no means all of the footage has been graded. So you can see that 13, 9, 10, 6, these have already got grades on them. If you take a look at the codec for the footage that you recognize, you'll see it's Apple ProRes 422HQ. But we've also got a mixture of codecs and a mixture of formats. So we've got Apple ProRes 422HQ. This is just regular HD color space. And we've also got DNxHR HQX. Now, if you click on clip 2 for this, you will actually see you have a very different quality of image you're working with. And if you look at all of these DNxHR clips, you'll see that they're very flat. Don't worry about clip 6 because there's a grade on it. It's very flat. If you look at the actual scopes, you'll notice that the contrast is really reduced. And this is a common feature these days of a lot of material that's being shot, is that it's actually shot in such a way as to try and preserve as much of the highlights and as much of the shadows as possible in order for us to be able to address it to the correct color space that we actually need to be able to either broadcast it or screen it or project it or watch it on our phones or computer screens or whatever. So this is a common thing for a lot of material these days to be shot in this format. There is a clip at the beginning here that's the PSD. So you can see it's a PSD. So this is a Photoshop file. So it's a graphic. Now, just want you to just do a little bit of a sanity check for me. If you click on clip 2, for example, you'll see here with clip 2 that the highlights are sitting under that 512 line. And the shadows, whilst they're near the 0, they're not at the 0 by any stretch of the imagination. So there's nothing really that's black in this shot, and there's nothing really that's bright in this shot at all. If you take a look at clip 5, again, you're familiar with this, you'll see that a lot of those pixels are actually sitting at 0. So there are black pixels in there. And the highlights here are sitting between the 768 and the 896 line. But again, it's quite sort of heavy in the red in that. Okay, so the thing is here is that by default, Resolve's not going to for want of a better expression, dick around with anything. When you bring material into Resolve for editing or for color grading or whatever, Resolve will actually give you that footage as it's meant, as its original color space. So we get to see this very sort of washed out log footage. The slight problem with that is that obviously then every single shot then needs to be graded. And there's nothing wrong with that as such. If I select clip 2 again, obviously I could stretch the contrast of this and actually manipulate that in pretty much the same way that we have been doing with the rest of our HD footage. Have at it. However, one of the advantages of DaVinci Resolve is that we can actually tell Resolve to be able to interpret the footage into the correct color space. And the way that we do that is we use something called Resolve Color Management. Resolve Color Management. Previously, there was quite a little manual things that we needed to do with Resolve Color Management to really leverage the power of it. But the new Resolve Color Management will actually read any metadata that's actually with the original media. So if you've shot it in a particular color space, Resolve should be able to read that and correctly interpret this for the color space that you ultimately want to output to. It sounds like witchcraft, and it probably is the closest thing to witchcraft that I can think of. So before we go any further with this timeline, what we want to do is we actually want to go into our Resolve color management settings and tell Resolve what we want to do with it. So to start with, could I ask you to make sure that you're on clip 2 for me, please? So you're looking at a very sort of flat, snowy scene. There's definitely snow on the trees. There's mountains in the very distance, as you can see there. And we need to go to the project settings for this. So down in the bottom right-hand corner, click the little cog symbol to open up your project settings. Now, we've already been here before, so you should be very comfortable with what you're looking at here. However, we're not interested in the master settings. We are interested in the appropriately named color management settings. And here we actually have the color space options here. Thanks, guys. Yeah, color management. Make sure you're in color management for your project. So this is to do with this project, not Resolve as a whole, but just for this project. Now, by default, your new projects will all be created using a color science called DaVinci YRGB. That's fine, not a problem at all. Resolve receives the footage and it displays it in the same color space. Not a problem at all. Then you have your timeline color space, and this is ultimately what you actually want to deliver to. So pretty much we are still delivering sort of HD timelines in a HD color space. Yes, if you've got specific color spaces that you're delivering to, you might need to change this. But in this case, what we've got is we've got Rec 709, which is actually our HD color space. So all of this other footage has actually been shot in a different color space, in a log color space. And what we need to Resolve to do is actually to translate that into the HD color space. We need to change the color science menu here from DaVinci YRGB to DaVinci YRGB color managed. So DaVinci YRGB color managed, and then we have a set of presets for the color management. There's lots of controls for this, which you can get into if you want to use this option here. But the idea of the preset is that it allows us to just quickly apply a whole load of settings. So at the moment, the Resolve color management preset is set to SDR Rec 709, so standard dynamic range. In this case, we're going to click this menu and we're actually going to choose DaVinci wide gamut, which is kind of just like a great big sort of, it encompasses most things. So let's choose DaVinci wide gamut. And that's it. That's all we need to choose here. And we're going to click Save down at the bottom of our project window. And straight away, you may need to just wait for it for a moment. You may need to just wait. The image changes in the viewer. And if you look at the scopes, you'll notice it's now a little bit brighter. It's not necessarily where we want it to be, but it's much brighter. You can see blue in the sky that you couldn't see before. And that's because DaVinci Resolve has actually read the metadata within this file and is actually transforming, it's applied a transformation to the color space in order to take it from that log footage that was originally shot into a HD color space. Magic. Witchcraft. If you click on clip 5, you will see that nothing has changed. And this is because this is a HD clip and it's in Rec 709 color space. So in this case, Resolve has correctly identified this again from the metadata that's possibly within the file. And it said, yep, that's HD. So I don't need to do anything with that. And you can verify this. If you right click that clip in the timeline here in the clips, clip 5, right click it, and you have something called your input color space. This is what Resolve actually is using as a sort of reference. So input color space. Now, this looks like a very scary menu, and indeed it is. But if you scroll through that list, you'll notice there should be a check mark somewhere. And this check mark is against Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. And because we're ultimately using Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 for the timeline, everything's fine. Doesn't need to change anything. Clip 2, which has been changed, along with all of the other DNxHR footage, if you right click that, choose input color space, scroll through the list, you'll see it's been identified as Rec 2100, so HDR footage basically. And it's applied that color space transformation so that it's now in a Rec 709 color space. This is what a lot of people tend to use LUTs for. They use LUTs to get into that Rec 709 color space from whatever color space they've shot. Now, occasionally, Resolve doesn't know how to treat some footage. So if you take a look at clip 1, everything is now completely washed out. We've lost that vibrance of the graphic. And the reason for this is because it's a PSD file, it's not actually containing any information as to what color space it should have. So in this case with Resolve, we actually need to tell it what the color space should be. So again, if you right click that clip and choose input color space, and you can see by default it's chosen ACES, but that is obviously wrong. So if we scroll down, because it's a graphic, we know that it actually should be sRGB. So if we now tell Resolve that that's sRGB, you can see it now correctly reinterprets it back into the 709 color space. So this is something that you should do at the beginning of the process of grading. Don't do it partway through because you'll throw off all the work that you've done. If you don't do it, you can still grade log footage in the same way that we've been doing. But if you do this, then what it will do is it will just help just to apply that color space transformation in order to at least give you a starting point for it. Okay. Good. Hopefully that is useful and clear. And you can see here we've got mixed formats as well. So providing Resolve understands the formats that you're using, then you shouldn't necessarily need to double check all of those input settings. Resolve now does that automatically for us. So you can work with all manner of footage in the same timeline. Okay, let's start to grade this footage then very quickly before we have a short break. We've gone through, we've changed the color space for this project now. So let's go to clip 2. Let's have a look at clip 2 here. We're going to be jumping around the timeline a little bit, but hopefully you've all got the confidence as to what we're going to be doing. Clip 2, let's try our auto balance controls, shall we? So here, let's choose the lift control for this. If we just take a look at the scope, first of all, you'll see the shadows are a little bit high. So there's probably nothing in there that's properly black. And obviously the highlights are now at the 640, so they could really be brought up. Let's try these auto balance controls. So we'll click on the lift. And again, we're looking for something that should be as black as we can get somewhere. So there's nothing in there that's really black as far as I can see. Probably something at the edge there that's around about sort of 3, 3, and 2. So again, I'm going to click on that. And again, you can see small change has been made. Small change is actually reduced it by -1 point on there. So Shift D turns that on and off. Yep, you can see there's a difference. Also, and I don't know if you can see this across the zoom, there is a definite change in the color balance as well. It's balanced, those shadows. Those shadows are a lot more solid black now. Let's select the white color balance. Pick white point, I should say. Auto balance. Now, again, what we want to do is we want to choose an area of the image that should be, as close to white as possible. Again, it's an automatic approach to this. It doesn't always work, remember. If you were following this in the book, I think the instruction is try and pick a point that's over 170 in either the red, green, or blue color channels. So somewhere around here in the middle, I think. I'm just looking at the numbers. Can't find anything particular. You can zoom in if you scroll with your mouse. You can actually zoom in to get a little bit closer, and you can use Shift Z in order to be able to come back out again. Somewhere there. So you can see there the numbers are 173 for red, 172, and 154. So a little bit high in the red and the green, less so in the blue. So a little bit sort of off towards the sort of the yellow side of things. So yellow snow's never good. I'm going to click once. Whoa! Shift Z. Whoa! Look at, well, the color balance has definitely changed, but it's blown everything out. And this is a problem with this shot. But you guys know, all we need to do is just lower the gain. So let's go into the gain controls here. Let's just click on this. Let's just bring this down. Again, I'll go fairly bright with this, but not 100% white. So around about the 896 line, can you see that color balance is now nice and even as well? And that is the resulting shot. Look at that blue sky, those trees in the foreground. Shift D turns that off. That's what we were dealing with before. And that, remember, was the one that's been transformed with the color space. Shift D again, turn that back on. Marvelous. Have a play with the gain, with the gamma as well. So, you could try, sort of bringing the gamma down, and it'll just sort of throw a bit more emphasis into the detail in the clouds and the background, losing a little bit of the emphasis off the trees. Again, always play with the gamma. Always play with the gamma. See what you can create with that. Cool. Okay, all good. Everyone having a good play. Let's jump ahead. Let's take a look at clip 16, 16, clip 16. Again, this is a log shot. Now, again, you can see actually looking at the shot I mean, it's very washed out, very low contrast again. Look at the scope. I mean, you know, the highlights are at 896, so the brightest parts of the image are probably about right. But look where those shadows are. I mean, they're at the 384 line. There's, you know, if this was a misty day, yes, maybe we could get away with shadows that high, but normally no. We need them to be down at the black. So for this, actually, one of the things is also worth pointing out here in the center there, you can actually see the blue channel is actually sitting a little higher than the green and the yellow. So again, it's a little bit too blue, a little bit cool. There's snow on the ground, so it's probably not a bad thing. But again, blue snow is not so good, maybe. For this, I'm actually going to be manipulating the red, green, and blue color channels independently of each other. So in this case, I'm going to switch the scope from waveform to parade. So switch the scopes from waveform to parade. And the parade is like a modified waveform. So it still has the 0 at the bottom, the 1023 at the top, but it's actually separated the red, green, and blue channels rather than have them over the top of each other. It's actually got them as separate, so you can see how well they are balanced independently of each other. And in this case, what I'm actually going to do is, rather than use the wheels that we've been using so far, I'm actually going to use these individual channel controls here. And for most of these controls, you've got 4 channels. You've got one that's white, and actually this represents what we call the luminance, or the Y channel in video. So video is Y RGB, and this is the Y channel: red, green, and blue. And again, you've got controls over lift, gamma, and gain. So first thing I'm going to do with this is bring those shadows down. So I'm going to do that in the Y channel here. So I'm going to click and drag this, bring it down. As I do so, you can see how the shot darkens. It's pulling everything down. So near the bottom there, and you can see there's definite differences in the amounts of the red, green, and blue channels within the image. With the gain, I'm going to bring this up. And again, I'm probably just going to go to that 896 line. That's probably a good sort of starting point on that. And again, I'll just play around a little bit with the mids just to see if I just brighten the mids up a little bit. Yeah, I quite like that. Gives a little bit more sort of crispness to the snow. I'll just pull the gain down a bit. I think by pushing up the mids, I think I've pushed the gain a little bit higher than I'd intended. Now, look at this. So the lower parts of the image, you can see the green is a little higher than the red, and the blue is much higher than both the green and the red. So if I come to the lift for the blue channel here, I can click and drag to the left on that, just bring the blue channel down pretty much independently from the other two, so that it's roughly the same level. This means that I've got equal amounts of red, green, and blue within the shadows at least. And again, it's probably I can bring down the green ever so slightly, much more sort of wobbling around with the red on that. So yeah, so probably tiny change to the green, if anything at all. I'm going to do the same for the highlights here. This sort of flat area here, I think, is probably this part of the image here at the top. And you can see again, there's quite a bit of blue in that. So I'm going to go to the gain, going to bring the blue down a little bit. So I've got equal amounts of red, green, and blue, possibly even just raise the red a touch, just so I can see that it's roughly equal. And again, Shift D, that's what I started with. Oh my God. And that's now what I've got. Push a little bit of green into the gamma. Let's just see what happens. Yeah, no, I'll just leave that, I think. Reset the gamma there. Oh, no, I needed to push a little bit more into the gamma, didn't I? There we go. Ruined my grade already. There we go. Good. So that just shows you how when you're trying to use the wheels on their own, you are trying to balance within a tonal range the image. So you pull red out, you add in blue. Here, using these lower controls, you can actually adjust the individual color channels, and you've got the ability to be able to go in specifically on that color channel without worrying too much about how you're affecting the other color channels. Whereas before, using the wheels, you would have to sort of balance one hue against another. So this is where you've got a lot more control over this than using the actual color wheels themselves. But we can go much further than this as well. Could you go to clip 4 for me, please, in this timeline? Clip 4. Again, another log shot. Similar to the last one, we've got this very wide shot. We've got these trees in the background, and in the foreground, we've got this sort of snowy wilderness. And obviously, we've got the horses. Notice we've got a slightly darker horse on the right and a slightly lighter horse on the left. So for this, we're actually going to use a different set of controls altogether. We're not going to use the color wheels or the primaries at all. For this, we're actually going to use the curves. Now, for those of you who've got a higher resolution monitor and you're actually seeing all of the controls spread out along the bottom, the curves should be showing automatically in the middle. If you've got all of the controls bunched together on the left-hand side of the screen, you need to click this button here for curves. So the one that looks like a little sort of, almost like a slide that you could sort of ski down maybe. So that's your curves button. So just click the curves button and it will reveal this set of controls here in the center. Just before we start to go in and start to sculpt the contrast and all the other different color channels as well, just taking a look at the scopes for this, and again I'm going to keep with the parade here. You can see that the blacks are very high again, so I need to just lower the blacks. The brightness of this again is very low because it's log footage anyway, so I do need to stretch it into the appropriate brightness. Again, there's nothing in there that should be particularly bright white, so I'm going to use my 896 line as a good sort of target for this. And also you can see the red channel is a little higher than the blue channel. Blue channel in the shadows, at least, there's probably a little bit more blue in the shadows than there is in the highlights. So again, probably the blue channel could probably do with a little bit more love and appreciation there. So again, I've got a set of controls for this, and you'll notice here on the top of this, you've actually got Y, RGB, and they're all linked together by default. This histogram that I'm looking at here represents the histogram of the original shot. So again, you can see that the shadows are starting here, the highlights are starting here, and that equates with the vertical measurement on the scopes here. So I'm going to take this black point here and I'm going to click on it and I'm going to drag it to the right. As I do so, I'm actually just lowering those shadows just so that they start to, and my phrase here is tickle the zero line. I just want them to tickle the zero line. And I'm going to do the same with the highlight point, which is here at the top right. I'm going to drag that up here to the 896 line. The 896 line. And what I've just done is I've stretched the contrast. It's just like using the master wheels underneath the color wheels. I've stretched the contrast. I've set the blacks at 0. I've stretched the gain, but I've just used a different set of controls. That's all. So now I've done that. What I've got is I'm looking at a much more sort of stretched out contrast shot. So Shift D, you can see what I've just done. See how the trees now pop, the horses, particularly the one on the right is now much more noticeable in this shot. So Shift D, turn that on and off. And this group of pixels here in this histogram here represents the darker parts of the image. So it's much more representative of this top part of the image here. This sort of section of pixels here where you've kind of got a bit more separation between the blue, green and red here represents these sort of warmer parts of the image down at the bottom. So even though they're sort of left and right on the histogram, actually they're different parts of the image in terms of the top and bottom of the image as we're looking at it. So I'm going to come here, and this is where you can sculpt the contrast a little bit more, and you've got much more control with the curves than you have with the simple slider of the gamma here. So what we can do here is we can actually come into the curve at this point, and we can just click to add a control point to it. And if I come to this point here, roughly where the foreground parts are, probably sort of maybe slightly to the right of it rather than on it directly. And now what I can do is I can actually grab those points and I can pull that section down. And can you see how it's just darkening the top part of the image as I'm doing that? So I'm pulling that down, pushing a bit more contrast into the midtones. So rather than sort of raising or lowering the mids, I'm now applying contrast within the mids. And here I can take this here as well, this control, I can bring it up. And as I do so, again, I'm just pulling that foreground up, making it brighter and really sort of pushing the contrast within those, within that shot. So I've kind of effectively done 2 contrast adjustments, one for the whole image and one for just the middle part of the image, the middle tonal range of the image. You can also now go in and you can now do additional changes if you need to with this. We'll just do this very, very quickly. So for example, here with the red channel, you can see it's a little bit high for me. I've got a little bit of sort of the redness from this part of the image here. So if I just select the red channel here, then what I can do is I can actually just grab the red channel and just bring it just so that it's a little bit further down into the blue and green. So you can see I'm adjusting just the red there. And again, Shift D, that's what we had before. It's incredible, isn't it? That's what we had before. And that's what we've now got. Cool. Very, very good. We like this. We like this a lot. It's like painting, you know, and you're recomposing the shot and bringing all of the detail out. Fantastic. Just one more little exercise and then we will have a short break on this. So this is, for this clip, we'll go to clip 11. So clip 11 for me, please. Again, another log shot here. This time it's a landscape shot, and we've got this sort of tractor in the foreground here. You'll notice again we've got quite it's quite a nice sort of range of contrast on this shot here. So you can see that the shadows, they're almost at the 0 line, almost, not quite. If we're being picky, probably there's much more red, touch less green, and touch less blue in the shadows. So again, the shadows, you know, those sort of dark parts of the image, they'll be a little bit cool, or a little bit on the cool side. In terms of the highlights, again, there's probably, well, there is less blue in that. So even though we've got this nice blue sky, actually there's a little bit of warmth in the shot. So you can see here in the mountains in the background, for example, there's obviously sun shining on that. I mean, these are all things just to take into account, actually. So let's look at how we can use the curves for this as well now. So let's go in, and you know how we dealt with the moose shot earlier, where we were able to manipulate the Y channel separate from the red, green, and blue. Well, we can do exactly what we've just done in the previous shot with this. So if you click on the Y channel for your luminance, and again, it's showing us a sort of, you know, where the shadows are starting here, and it's telling me it's a little bit more in the middle, so there's probably less in the highlights than is registering on this histogram here than is actually measured in the scopes. If we take the shadows, if we take the black control there and just push that up slightly to the right, you can see how we're just pushing those black pixels down towards that 0 line. Again, you don't need to make, you know, this isn't about making huge changes. Somebody once said to me that color correction and grading is like romance. A little goes a long way. There you go. Let's take the highlights here and let's just bring them up. Again, I don't want to go all the way with this. Don't want to go all the way there. But again, let's sculpt that with the little S curve here. So let's add a control point at this point here in this group of sort of dark pixels. So let's add a control point there. Let's add another control point here to the right of those pixels, and let's just push that a little bit more into the gain and bring that down into the shadows, just to stretch that contrast in the mid-range portion of the image as well. Good. Shift D. Well, you can see that there's definitely a change to that. You know, those shadows are much more solid now, possibly a little bit too much. So I'll just add a touch back into there. Again, it's just minute changes sometimes. This is why it's quite difficult to sort of almost operate with a mouse. If you're using a trackpad, good luck. But even with a mouse, you're clicking, you're holding, you're moving. You know, this is where the control surfaces come in. With their control with the wheels, because you can actually manipulate different parts of the image together, and you can also turn knobs and dials for the curves as well. Let's switch to the blue channel for this, and again with the highlights here, I'm just going to push a bit more blue into the highlights there, and that just cools the shot down a little bit overall. And actually, I'm just going to stop there, actually, because I'm just going to undo that change. It's going to undo that change because what I wanted to do is actually I needed to use a separate node. I've just gone a little bit too far with that. So don't make any change to the blue channel just yet. So what I've got here is I've got the initial change I've just made to the contrast is actually in this node. But what we can do is we can actually string together multiple nodes in order to create the overall grade. So here, first of all, I'm going to rename this node so that I know what's in it. So in this case, I'm going to right click him and choose node label. And then we're going to call this balance. So that's just the overall balance of the contrast. And now I need to create a new node. So if I right click here, I can choose add node. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got lots of different nodes to choose from, but in this case, we're only interested in a serial node. So basically a serial node is added in order. So in this case, by adding a serial node, I add it after the original node that I had for this grade. So let's choose add serial. So I've now got two nodes and you can see that they are connected. So the output of this node is going directly into the input of this node here. I'm going to right click on the second node. I'm going to choose node label and we're just going to call this color. So it's always useful to label your nodes so that you know what's in, what each of them are doing. So now with this node selected, I can come to the blue color channel. And now I can actually do what I was doing before. So I'm just going to add in a little bit more blue into the highlights there, just to cool off the highlights and pretty much cool off the whole shot. And ever so slightly in the shadows, I'm just going to, I mean, it's just, if it's worth doing, it's only worth doing a small minor amount just to bring that blue color channel down. And if I want to just see the change that I've made to that node on its own, not the whole grade, Shift D will disable the whole grade. But if I want to see what that node is changing, if I use Control or Command D. So Command D disables that node, and it's so, yeah, I mean, in the clouds particularly, that's off. The clouds have a slightly yellowy sort of tint to them. And with that on, the clouds have lost some of that yellowness. And in actual fact, I'm going to go even further with that blue color channel. There we go. That's really cleaned up those clouds there. So again, Command or Control D, look at that. You can see those clouds. Before they looked as though they were almost stained with tobacco, nicotine, but now with that on, they're much cleaner. Thanks, guys, for pointing this out. Yeah. So I'll just give you a second just to play with that. And we're just going to do one more thing, and then we'll have a break. Same node that I've got selected here with the color, but this time we're going to go in with the green channel here, the green channel. And here, if I just zoom in on this part of the image here with the scroll of my mouse, can you see I've got an eyedropper here? And if I just come along here and I click where that green grass is, and you might be tempted to click on this green crate, but it's the green grass that we're interested in here. So if I click on the green grass, it will sample that part of the image. And you can see here on the green color channel, it's actually added a control point. So I can now click on that and I can just ever so slightly, again, you can see, you know, too much, everything will go magenta. But I just want to pull a touch of green out of the shot. It is minuscule, the amount that we need to just pull out, but it will just kind of pump a lot of warmth into that shot overall. Shift Z so that I can bring the image right back to full screen, and again, Command or Control D. That's what we just had. You can see that greenness in the midtones as well, and then it's actually just sort of warmed the whole shot up really. Is everyone having fun? Certainly hope so. This is probably the most fun that you can have in front of a computer. Well, probably not. Well, no, we're not even going to go there. Right. Stop. Excellent. Okay. So what we're going to do is we are now going to have a break. Let's have our usual 15 minutes, 15 minutes, please. And we shall be back just to finish up this lesson and then take a look at all of the other things that we can do with color as well. So hopefully you found that useful. So 15-minute break, and then we will carry on with this project. Well, I think that's enough of Will Smith there. Or should I say Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, as he was known at the time. So that was a special request. You know who you are. You know who you are. Okay. Normal service will be resumed before too long, so don't worry about that. We'll be back on that. Okay. So we were working on the previous project. Sorry, there we go. We're working on this, and we're pretty much approaching the last part of this lesson here. Hopefully everyone's kind of got a good sort of grip as to the sort of things that we can do. The important thing to remember about what we've just been doing over the last couple of hours is that these controls aren't to be used in isolation from each other. You can absolutely swap. You can use whichever control you prefer. There's no particular use of the curves beyond this fact that you've got much more control over, the individual parts of the image that we've been talking about. So the fact that you can sort of sculpt effectively much easier than you can do with the actual wheels themselves. You just simply use the control that you want to use to get the result that you want. I've spoken to a number of colorists. I mean, I personally am not a colorist, I'm an editor, but I do a lot of color correction myself, and I've spoken to a number of colorists over the years that I've been working with Resolve, and I usually ask them, who prefers to use, the curves, who prefers to use the wheels. I personally prefer to use the wheels, although I tend to use the individual controls within those wheels these days, just to be able to fine tune things much easier, rather than have to, use the color wheels. But a lot of colorists will say that they use the curves as well. So it's just about understanding how the controls are working and understanding what we're aiming for, that nice, balanced, pleasing image as a good sort of starting point. So that's the idea of getting there. So hopefully that sort of addresses any confusion as to, which one should I be using? You use the one that's appropriate for you, the one you like best, to be honest, the one you find easier to use and gives you the results that you want. So it's giving you options more than anything. But the other thing about this process is, remember, we've just been talking about single shots. And although we mentioned earlier about being able to sort of scrub through a clip and actually see if there are any particular issues with a clip that might crop up and cause you problems, generally we've been okay with by simply grading one frame. We don't need to worry too much about adjusting that throughout the shot. However, when you're working with edited material, of course, it's never about just one shot. It's about a sequence of shots. And generally, but not always, footage tends to be grouped together so that you can use different sorts of techniques in order to be able to transfer a grade from one shot to another. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at a couple of examples of bringing a grade from one shot onto another, and show you the ways in which you can manage those grades. So same project, same timeline as before. And what I'd like you to do is, could you go to clip 6 to start with, please? So clip 6. Clip 6 was actually one of these clips which we personally didn't grade. This was already graded as part of the project. So we're dealing with something that's actually already graded for us. And you can see here that what we've got is we've got this shot here of a nice sort of snowy wilderness shot with the hills in the background and a cabin in the foreground. And you can see that there's actually a node already on it called balanced. So again, if you just press Shift D will actually just show you that that was the original shot, color managed, but that was the original shot. And if you press Shift D again, that will just show you the changes that have been made to that. You could actually probably trace those through the color, the primary wheels here. You can see the blacks, the lift has actually been lowered slightly. I think the gain's been raised a touch, and the gamma's been lowered ever so slightly. I think just by looking at that as well, there's slight adjustments made to the color balance, but generally just, you know, minor things again. So what we want to do here is we actually want to take this clip and we want to be able to apply the grade possibly to other shots. And if you actually take a look at clip 7 here in the timeline, you can actually see clip 7 is effectively the same shot, but obviously shot, it's probably on a zoom lens. So here we've got the same shot, probably taken from the same position, probably with the same setup, almost certainly. So rather than trying to grade that separately, it would make sense to actually transfer the grade from clip 6 across to clip 7. So there's a good couple of ways that we can do this. First of all, you can just simply copy and paste. If you select clip 6, then you can go to the edit menu and choose copy. Command Control C will also work here. Select clip 7 and then choose edit paste, or of course Command or Control V. And that will actually then paste the grade from the first selected clip to the second clip. And again, you can see if you were to go to clip 6, if I just turn off the loop here, I can actually play from one shot into the next. And again, the two shots next to each other cut nicely from one to the other. So again, we're consistent across those two shots. And that's probably the most important thing to remember here is about, it's not necessarily getting the shots right with all the creative looks and all the rest of it. It's about being consistent. If you're consistent across the shots, that's the main challenge when you're color correcting a sequence. Clip 11 is one that we graded here. So again, we've got our balance node here and we've got the color node. And if you take a look at clip 12, again, it's a similar sort of shot. It's a similar sort of starting setup for that. So we've got another way in which we can transfer the grade across. Now, if you've got a mouse that actually has a middle button, then what you can do is if you select clip 12, that's your target clip. That's the clip you're going to affect. So that's the clip that needs to be selected. What you can then do is move over clip 11, and then you can middle click clip 11 and it will actually transfer the grade across. If, however, you don't have a middle mouse, if you're using a trackpad or something like that, then an alternative to that is actually select clip 12, right click on clip 11 and choose apply grade. And that will actually transfer the grade across. And again, you can see those two shots then pretty much cut. There's probably a little bit more of a lift in the lower parts of the shadow there that could probably just bring those in line, but we'll address that in a second. So you select the target clip or clips. You can actually select multiple clips using this technique, and then you middle click the clip that you want to copy the grade from. So in this case, you would select clip 12 and middle click clip 11. Okay, so that gives you a couple of options for transferring grades between different clips. Another option that you've got though is to actually save the grade and actually save a reference image of the shot. And this can be useful if you want to use the same grade or at least the same portion of a grade over and over again. So here, if we choose clip 8, so with clip 8, we've got this sort of shot here of the two ranchers side by side. And again, there is a balanced node on this. So if we just press Shift D to disable that, you can see that we've got that sort of very red sort of, color cast to these shots that we're used to by now. So Shift D, turn that on, and you can actually see it's just addressed the main contrast along with that red color cast. And again, you can see here these highlights here, they're the 896 line. The 896. This is the main highlight of this lady's hat here. So that gives you sort of a reference for the highlight for that. So you'll notice neither of the two shots either side are necessarily relevant to this. I mean, this is an interview with the same lady, obviously, but the interview itself might have a completely different grade anyway. So what we're going to do with this is we're actually going to save a still of this. So make sure you've got clip 8 selected, and then just simply right click in the actual viewer itself. So right click, and then you can choose grab still. So when you grab the still, you will get the still will appear actually in the gallery. It's given a number reference, which is to do with the timeline track that it's from, the shot number from that, but it's far easier to actually label them, particularly if you're doing multiple versions of a grade and you want sort of different options to be able to apply them, and you're using the same shot. You don't want to do, which I've done in the past, which is actually create multiple images and not label them, because then you don't know which one you should be working to. So learn from my mistakes. Always label your gallery stills. So in this case, we right click and we choose the option called change label. It's in a different place and called a different thing from the nodes, but hey, it's pretty much the same thing. So change label, and we'll just call this ranchers balance. Ranchers balance. Now you can use your gallery stills in two main ways. The first is you can use them as a visual reference. So you can see how one shot is matching another. So this is another good way of being able to match shots across the timeline. But the other thing is that the gallery still itself saves the grade. So you've actually got all of that node structure that you built, no matter how complicated, is actually saved as part of that gallery still. So this means you can actually use it in order to be able to not only save stills, but also save grades and then apply them at some point in the future. So if we take a look at clip 14 in the timeline, so if we select clip 14, obviously this is the same couple, same two ranchers, same scene, probably same location, same setup, I would imagine, from the camera, or similar setup. So again, the still that we've created is probably a good starting point. Might not be the ending point, but it's a good starting point for what we need to do. So just a quick word on this. when you've got this clip selected and you move your mouse over this gallery still, what Resolve does is it automatically live previews that grade. It hasn't applied it, not yet, but it's live previewing it. And so I always find this a little bit of a jump, because the image jumps to the portion of the clip where my mouse happens to be. So if I approach this from the right, you see it jumps, and I don't really get a sense as to how the grade has affected the clip. Maybe this is just me, I don't know. So what I tend to do is I actually tend to approach the gallery still from the left and then actually bring it over, because then you can see the first frame doesn't move, it doesn't jump, and it actually shows you how the clip is going to be affected by the application of that grade. I know it's a minor thing, but it's something that, you know, sometimes I just go over the grade and go, no, I don't understand what's happened. But there I can very clearly see. So if I want to apply this grade now, if you just simply right click on the still, you've then got the option there to apply grade. And this will apply all of the nodes in that particular grade. But the second way in which we can use these stills is as a reference shot. And again, it's the frame that you actually grab initially that's being used as the reference shot there. And in order to use this as a reference shot, the easiest way of doing this is actually just to simply double click the actual still itself. Now, double clicking itself just loads it as a reference shot into the viewer. It doesn't apply the grade. The two things are different processes. So in this case, if I double click this now gives me a split screen effect. So on the left-hand side at the moment, the left-hand side is the image that I have selected in the timeline, and on the frame that I have selected. And on the right-hand side, I've actually got my reference still. So rather than just simply relying on the grade being applied, I can actually now make a visual comparison between the two. This has enabled this side-by-side view here, this split screen view, image wipe as it is there. And you can also choose the direction of the wipe. So at the moment I'm horizontal, so it's from left to right. And I've also got a vertical split, diagonal split, a mix, so forth. So again, you've got different ways in which you can actually compare the images side by side. And you can also just simply drag the border between the two in order to be able to see any differences between them. So you can actually do a comparison over different parts of the image. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when I move that border back and forth, if you look at the scopes down in the bottom right, you can actually see that it's actually giving me a side-by-side comparison in the scopes, which means you can use the scopes as a reference. I'll show you what I mean. There is obviously a difference here between these two shots, because just simply applying a grade from one to the other doesn't mean that the shot themselves had the original starting point. It's like adjusting audio level with normalize. No, it's not. It's not adjusting. It's like adjusting a clip and using copy and paste attributes to paste to another clip. If that clip had a different audio level to start with, then it's not going to reach the same level. So in this case here, you can see that there's a definite change in sort of the warmth and the brightness of the shot, particularly the skin tones and things like that. So here I can actually just keep dragging this dividing line here off the edge of the monitor, and it will actually flip it around to the other side so that I can do a comparison on this side. And if I do that here, you can see split screen using this lady's hat as a reference, and you can see that there is a definite difference in terms of the overall contrast and brightness of that hat. Now, if I keep wiggling this around here and find a split, you can see here in the scopes, I can actually see that there's a difference in the scopes. So here, if I go back and forth, you can see on the left side of that split is the brighter hat, and on the right-hand side is the slightly duller hat. So now I can use that as a reference point for this. So I want to increase probably the overall gain in order to bring those levels up. So with this shot still selected, I'll come to my gain control, maybe use the luminance value just to pull that up and see those lines so that they're up to the same level on the scopes. So the green and the blue is at the same level, but look at this, the red needs pushing up a little bit more as well. So I'm going to go to my gain control for the red channel and just bring that up so that it's again the same sort of level there. And straight away you can see now there's much more of an equal comparison to the brightness of that hat, and also see her skin tones. She's slightly out of focus here, but you can see the skin tones, the scarf, the jacket is much more of a closer match. If I come and compare the fella here on the left, again, the hat looks as though it's the same hat. Well, it is, of course, but it looks, it's a match. And again, the skin tones are a little bit more even than they were before. So that gives you an idea how you can use the gallery stills as a reference, as well as a place in which to store your images. But it also brings up something else as well. Just simply copying and pasting a grade from one shot to another doesn't necessarily mean that that shot is correct. It's all about the original settings that we use to shoot that particular shot. And cameramen are always good for adjusting the exposure ever so slightly and that sort of thing. And and a wide shot might have a slightly different color balance than a close-up shot. It's worth trying, but always be prepared to go in and just manipulate slightly if need be. To remove this split screen now, all I just need to do is just click on the image wipe button here in order to just click and remove it. And you can see I can just quickly bring it back up if I need to, but I can just simply click that just to remove that. Okay. So that gives us a little bit of an insight into how we can manage different grades across different shots. Copy and pasting is one option, middle clicking is another, and also we can also use the gallery stills in that way. That brings us it brings us to the end of what is lesson 9 in your book. So what we'll do is we'll just spend the rest of this session looking at the next 2 chapters. And these chapters are relatively short. They just, again, give you an insight into some of the things that we can do in the color page. But lesson 10 is dedicated to something called secondary adjustments. As I mentioned previously, everything we've just done so far in this session is actually called a primary correction or a primary adjustment. And what that means is that although you might be sort of targeting the adjustment into the lift or the gamma or the gain, it's actually applying it to the whole image. So all elements of the image that fall within that part of the tonal range are going to be affected. What we're talking about with secondary adjustments are we're actually trying to target a specific part of the image and actually try and separate it in some way so that we can adjust it on its own. I mean, if you have something like Photoshop, for example, with lots of different layers, it's fine. You can actually isolate those layers and adjust them in their own right, but we're not dealing with that. We're not dealing with compositing. We're dealing with flat images that have been shot. And so we need to isolate the images and use different techniques for that. So we're going to look at a few techniques. They are listed here. First of all, we are going to show the addition of power windows. And power windows are just masks. And you can use them to help divide up the frame and the objects within the frame. We'll also look at other options as well that you've got, including some of the curves, also have sort of targeting kind of techniques that you can use. But the main topic we're going to use is something called a qualifier. And a qualifier is where you make a selection on the image based on its hue, saturation, or luminance values, or a combination of all three. And it's useful for being able to select things like skin tones, for example. So we'll take a look at an example of that. We'll also look at how you can affect both the inside and the outside of a selection that you're making using a particular node called the outside node. So this is the second type of node that we're going to look at in this session. And finally, we're going to look at how you can then track power windows, and also how you can use some of the resolve effects that we were looking at in the edit page yesterday, how we can actually incorporate some of the resolve effects into our grades as well. So that's what we mean by secondary adjustments. How do we target a portion of the image so that we can adjust that section of it? So we're going to carry on working in the same project for this, but we're going to use a different timeline. So from the pop-up menu at the top of your color page, where we've been working on the mixed cameras timeline, if you click in there and just choose the secondaries timeline for me, please. So secondaries timeline. Now this is the same edit, but it's effectively, it's graded. So each of the shots bar, a small number, actually all have grades on, which we've just followed in the previous lesson. So I'll just give people an option there, just to open up the secondaries timeline from that menu there. And from this shot, from this timeline, sorry, could you go to the very end to clip 18? So this is the last clip in your timeline here. And we've already got a node on there. It's the balance node, as you can see. A wonderful sort of evocative shot of the landscapes in this part of the world. Shift D, just to turn that on and off. And again, you can see, just how that initial balance control has just been used to just sort of punch the contrast, particularly the contrast, a little bit. I'm just looking at the primaries wheels. Yeah, there's been a slight adjustment to the color balance as well. The gain color balance here has been slightly cooled off, and the shadows, by the looks of it, have also been slightly cooled down. With the it's actually been warmed up slightly. So yeah, amongst other things. And you can see that this indicator here tells me that this has actually been changed. So none of the others have been changed by the looks of it. Okay, so I mean, that's fine. This is all very well and good. But one of the things is that it's we really want to make it a little bit more dramatic. This is the final shot within our scene. So surely we should be able to make this more dramatic. So first of all, let us add a new node to this. So we can right click this node and we can choose add node, and we're going to add a serial node to it. However, if you're into your keyboard shortcuts, it's worth knowing that Option or Alt S will add a serial node. So Option or Alt S adds a serial node, and we only need one, so I'll just undo that for the moment. And with this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to divide the image into two. we're actually going to use this sort of horizon line here running through the image in order to separate this upper part of the image, this sky and the mountain, from this foreground part of the image here. So on this node here that you've just created, right click, change the node label, just call it something like sky, for example. So new node, new serial node, and label it sky. And for this, we're just going to simply create a mask. A mask in Resolve's color page is actually called a power window. It's one of those terms that's referred to in Resolve. You can access your windows by using this little button here. So again, it's in the center of my controls here. But if your screen is of a small resolution, then you'll find it over here somewhere instead on the left hand side. So you're looking for that that button there for your power windows. So I'm going to click on that, and you can create power windows. You've got, like with most masks, you can create squares, rectangles, you can create circles, you can create lines that you can draw, and actually this creates a mat. And you've also got the ability to be able to create Bezier shapes as well. So you can actually draw around, irregular shapes. Here, that's actually your mat rather than that one. Sorry, that's your mat. But generally we would do sort of squares, we would do ovals and that sort of thing. So in this case, let's just click to add a simple linear square here. And you can see here from the image in the thumbnail, you can see that it's actually just choosing to show the middle part of the square. If you click this button here, your highlight button, this will show you the portion of the image that you're actually going to be affecting. So in this case, you can see it's the inside of the power window. And as well as the actual sort of main shape of the power window and the location of the power window, you've also got these sort of softness areas around the outside. So you can see it actually falls away, it actually it actually doesn't blur the image, but it actually fades the mask out as we approach the far edge. And you can actually extend that out a little bit more, so you can actually smooth that blurring, so you can actually sort of blend it into the original image some way. So let's turn the highlight off, because the overlay actually shows us the shape and position of this power window. So I'm just going to use this center control here. I'm just going to pick it up and just move it into position. So I'm just going to place it somewhere here. Just drag this middle control here, drag it out to something like that. Probably just need to bring this down a little bit. I'm going to use those sort of trees as a light. Actually, they're trees and cows, I think. If I just scroll down here as well and just scroll out a little bit, I can just lift that up. And you don't worry about going outside of the image. Actually, the further outside you go, the less likely it is that you're going to get parts of the image that you've missed at all. So use the scroll wheel on your mouse to scroll in and out. And if you've got a middle mouse button as well, you can actually click and hold the middle mouse button and move around. So yeah, that's an alternative to that. So again, not too worried about getting it to be absolutely perfect at all. But if you then press Shift Z, that will return us to full screen again. I'm just going to increase the softness at the edge there, just so that it blends in with the foreground. Again, the thumbnail is showing me what part of the image I do have selected within the mask. And now I've got the mask on and it's been applied to a node. Any change that I make within that node actually will apply to the inside of that mask. So in this case, if we come to the gamma controls and use the master wheel for the gamma. And I'm just going to bring the gamma down slightly. And again, you would need one eye on the scopes to see this, but the main change, of course, will be in the viewer here. So if I do that, you can actually see how I'm adjusting inside that power window. So let me just undo that change. And again, I'll just bring the midtones down a little bit, just to put a little bit more sort of moodiness into those clouds there as well. And I'm also just going to push possibly a little bit of warmth into the mids as well. So probably a little bit more sort of readiness. So again, it sort of feels a little bit more sort of like later in the day. So again, you can see from the scopes how I've just pushed a little bit of red into the highlights, sorry, into the midtones there. You should always have one eye on the scope so that you understand what you're doing, but this is much more on the creative side of things now, rather than trying to, you know, balance the image and get that nice, that nice looking image. We're now really starting to push things a little bit more in a creative sense. Now, that's adjusted the sky. Now, if you want to see what it looks like without the mask, then you can actually come to this menu here down at the bottom, and you can just choose it to turn it off. And that's what the shot now looks like without the mask. If I actually want to just disable this, remember, to disable a single node, it's Command or Control D. So if I press Command D, just to disable that, again, you can see much more of a sort of a warmth, slightly later in the day feel there, big skies. But now the other side of it is I might want to actually adjust the outside of the mask. So rather than actually having to sort of maybe even copy the node and reset the mask and things like that, I can actually use the information from this node here. I can actually use to send it to another node so that I can adjust the outside of the mask. So let's turn the power window back on by clicking this button here and choosing power window from the menu. And I'm going to right click this node, choose add node, and choose to add an outside node. An outside node. And you can see now that what it does is it actually has two connecting arrows. The first one, the green one, is actually the red, green, and blue video information, the image information going from one node to the other. As we talked about, what you do in one node subsequently is affected further through the pipeline by the following nodes. But this dotted blue arrow here, this represents the alpha channel information from this clip that's moving to this clip, and you can see it's automatically giving me the opposite side of the mask. So now I can actually come in and I can actually start to manipulate the image further. And if I just increase the gamma slightly, you can actually see how I'm now affecting the lower part of the image. So I shall do that, and then I will probably even just cool down the gain slightly, just to maybe push a little bit of coolness into that sort of snowy scene, contrasting against the warmth of this sort of sky. So it makes the whole shot just feel a little bit on the cooler side. Yeah, very cool, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, you can't leave anything untouched now. It's so easy now to manipulate the images. You will not be able to leave anything alone. The next example, this is a good one, just to play around with as well. It's kind of like a secondary example, but again, there's a little bit more to it. We'll look at it. Let's select clip 12. So clip 12 here is this shot, which you'll remember from earlier. And in this case, we've got a tonal balance control here, and then we've got the color balance. And remember, this was actually copied across from the previous shot of the tractor. And what we have here is obviously we've got a very sort of noticeable bright green. I don't know what it is. A thresher. I don't know. You know, it might be that you look at that and actually think, you know what, it's standing out a little bit too much. It maybe needs to be maybe a bit more brighter, for example, because maybe this is the subject of what we're talking about. All sorts of reasons why you might want to sort of minimize the impact of this green threshing machine or whatever it is, or even actually enhance it in some way. So we're going to use the tonal and color balance that we've currently got, but we're going to add a new serial node. So Option Alt S to add a serial node. And here we're going to choose the node label, always label things, remember, and we're just going to call this green thresher. I've no idea what it is. Maybe there's some farmers amongst you that know exactly what that is. Doesn't matter, does it? No, it doesn't matter at all. Okay. So we've got that. Now, a couple of ways in which we can isolate that green threshing machine. One of them is we can actually use the curves for this. And this is quite useful if you want to be able to sort of, if there's something that stands out, you want to be able to isolate it. This is a good way of being able to do this. So go to your curves controls. So again, for those of you who've not got the 3 panels along the bottom, if you could just simply click on that curves button. And this is what we're looking at here. But we don't want the custom curves. No. Instead, you'll see that we've actually got a series of dots along the top here for the different controls that we've got for the curves. But the easiest place is to get this from the custom menu here from this little pop-up. So we're currently looking at the custom curves. If you click in there, you'll notice you've got a number of other curves. And I've noticed that other nonlinear editors have got very similar controls in them now. Final Cut and Premiere, for example. Resolve's had them for an awfully long time. You've got something called hue versus hue, hue versus sat, hue versus luma, luma versus sat, sat versus sat, and sat versus luma. And it all sounds a little bit, what do they mean? But basically the first of those controls, so for example, hue versus hue, means that you make a selection on the hue of the image, a portion of the hue, and then you can make changes to that hue. So you make a hue selection to change the hue. You make a hue selection to change the saturation. You make a hue selection to change the lumen. You got the idea. Okay, so how does this work in practice? Well, if you click on the hue versus hue curve, what you've effectively got is the usual color wheel, which is usually presented as obviously a circle. It's stretched out. So we go from red through yellow, through green, through cyan, through blue, through magenta, and back to red again, which then picks up on the other side. So it's effectively like an infinite spectrum of hue. And you can see from these spikes, these are where the main hue is within the image. So you can see there's a spike here around about this sort of yellowy orange, which if you consider this sort of corn in the foreground and this background makes sense. A little spike around the green, That's our friend there. And you've also got a little spike around the sort of cyan into the blue, where of course we've got these blue skies. So what we want to do is we want to make a selection on this green threshing machine. So if I just zoom in a little bit on this here, just so that I can see it, and you'll see that I've got an eyedropper automatically on this. And I just want to click and just drag around just to select as much of that green as I can. So I've just clicked and dragged across that green machine. I'll just press the Shift Z just to be able to go back out to the full image. And now you can see that what I've done is I've actually added 3 control points based on that selection that I've just made. The one in the middle is effectively the bit of the green that I'm interested in. The 2 either side effectively means it just holds the rest of the curve in position. So this means that if I select this point here, I can now change the color of the green threshing machine. So if I bring that down a little bit, maybe bring it down, as I'm doing so, I'm turning it into a blue machine. Now you'll notice that I'm picking up, I've got a little bit of sort of green left in there. And that's just because when I sampled the green, I didn't sample all of the range of green that's within that. So again, if I just zoom in slightly here, what you can do here is you can actually just open out the controls here. So if I click and drag those out to the right and also to the left, it should start to pick up the rest of the green. Now, I need to be quite careful here, you know, just how far I do go in order to be able to pick it up. It's not going to be perfect, and it's all to do with the quality of the footage as well that you've got. And this footage is relatively compressed as well. But you can see that we can actually change the color of that machine. This is very useful if you've got somebody who's got sort of, you know, bright red lipstick or something like that, and you just want to tone it down slightly. This is a good technique for it. Now, slight downside to this is it will affect anything that actually falls across the image within that that hue that we've selected. But just to show you a couple of other things that we could do here, let's say I would just want to reset this. So hue versus hue. So I'll go back to a green threshing machine, big green threshing machine. And this time I'm going to choose hue versus sat. So I'm going to select the hue and I'm going to change the saturation. Again, same sort of curve, but different results. So I'm going to click and drag to make the selection. Same rules apply. There's my selection. Notice how wide it is now because I sampled a different portion, probably a bit more. So it's got a little bit more there. And if I increase the saturation, the green becomes slightly more intense. You can actually see from the curves how I'm actually affecting this. Or I could actually desaturate the threshing machine. So I could actually make it less intense within the shot. So again, depending on the result that I'm after, I might want to make it a little bit less green, or maybe make it much more green. So if this was an advert for big green threshing machines, I probably want to make the threshing machine stand out more against the background of the working farm. Another example here, and again, just that we can do it, is I can actually make a selection for the sky. So here, let's choose a bit of this blue here. And again, you can see there's the blue of the sky. So I can make the sky much more intense, or I can actually really sort of pull a lot of that intensity of the saturation out of the sky. And again, by doing that, I can also make much more of the green of the machine. again, this is all to do with you're making selections on the actual image itself. Whilst this is sort of making the selection just focus on the sky, if there is anybody that's perhaps wearing the same blue in the shot, that might also be picked up as well. So this is where you need to start to think about how you might combine these techniques with something like a power window as well, because that will help limit the overall area of effect for this. So we've got one more example here of a secondary correction. If you could go to clip 15, please, clip 15. So this is, of course, our female rancher. We've seen her a lot throughout this session. And this is a big sort of hero shot, isn't it? I mean, this is sort of like a good, nice, well-framed shot. It's quite moody in terms of the overall lighting here, and she obviously turns to look at the camera there. So we really do want to make the most of this. We really do. At the moment, we have a single node on there for the balance. So Shift D to disable the grade. That was how it was originally shot. Remember, of course, this is color managed as well, so there is a slight adjustment already applied to that, but you can see how warm this shot was. You've got this sort of very red background, you've got this very red scarf here, so Shift D. So that sort of warmth has been maintained, but the overall contrast has been improved. So one of the things that we're often required to do here with this sort of shot is to actually make a selection on somebody's skin. And this can be useful because, of course, you can then highlight the particular face or hands or something like that, and you can actually then make adjustments to them. So that's what we're going to do. Slight problem with this shot is, of course, the skin tone and kind of is sort of the same as the sort of the background and that sort of thing. So we're going to use a slightly different technique for this. We're going to use something called a qualifier. And a qualifier allows you to select a range of hue, the color, saturation, the intensity of that color, and also the luminance or brightness. So how bright or dark that particular range of selection is. So for this, we are going to add a new serial node. So let's press Option or Alt S to add that node. Remember, always label your node. So we're just going to call this skin. And for this one, we are going to use the qualifier. So something like the hue versus hue, for example, or the hue versus sat would be useful if we wanted to make a specific selection to adjust it in a specific way. Well, in this case, we actually want to make the selection so that we can adjust it in whichever way we want. So this is the set of controls that you need. It's this eyedropper button here in your sets of controls. So again, if you've got the 3 panels up, then you'll find this in the middle. If you've only got the 2, then you'll find it somewhere over here, but it's the same control. So it's this qualifier. And you can see here we've got hue, saturation, and luminance. We've got a few other controls here just to help us refine this. This is going to take a little bit of playing around with, so you need to be patient with this. It's not going to instantly give you the results you want. You do need to refine this a little bit. First of all, you've got your default selection. So this is what you're actually using your eyedropper to select. And very much like with the previous example, if you click and drag, you can increase the amount of the selection. Let me just show you how this works. If I take my selection here, I just want to click, I want to sample something of her skin tone. So something like maybe across the forehead here. This would be good, or maybe around her chin here. But I'm going to use the forehead over here. So I'm going to click, and you can see in the qualifier down at the bottom, you can see how I've now got ranges in the hue. the saturation and the luminance. So I'm going to click and drag across that, and you can see it's changing mainly the luminance. So as I click and drag that, you can see how it's refining that. Just let you catch up if you need to. Now, how do I know what I've selected? Yes, there's no indicator really. Well, apart from this node, and you can see here I've got an awful lot. It looks as though I've got selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our highlight. So click the highlight button. Now, everything that's not cut, everything that's sort of whited out there is actually not selected. So you can see in my selection, the sort of her eyes, the darker portions of the image are not selected. So you can see there's an awful lot of the image that I have selected. And this is all part of the process. You've got this option here. So you've got the highlight setting. I actually quite like this setting here. This is highlight black and white. So if I click on that, you'll see that that gives me an idea about what I have got selected. Anything that's white is selected. So now what I need to do is I now need to try and narrow this down. There's a couple of ways that I can do this. You can see that I've got a minus selection range and a plus selection range. So what I can do here is with the subtract picker is I can actually use that to remove sections of the image. So I'll just show you how this works. If I click on the minus option, I'll just turn the highlight off. Let's try and remove some of this scarf. So I'm going to click and drag to remove some of the scarf. And again, you can see how the hue, saturation, and luminance values have changed. If I now go back into the highlight, you can see now I've got much less selected, but the face, which is what I want, is not selected. So quite frustrating. This is all part of it. What you need to do, and the best way of working with this is actually to use your understanding of the image, understanding of colors for video in order to be able to manually refine things. If I want to make sure I've got a face, for example, then if I take a look at these controls, I know that faces are usually sat within the red to yellow area, actually probably the red to orange area. So rather than this section that I want selected, if I bring this back here, you can see that I can now change the areas that I've got selected. I can then refine that a little bit more, but also it's about saturation, the intensity. So if I just play around with that a little bit, just to open that out, and also luminance. Luminance is brightness. So here, this is the darker parts of the image. So if I just tweak that so that I'm excluding the darker parts, and then maybe just play around. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Yes. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I want to try and get it as close to her face as possible. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. That's a recognizable face, isn't it? So if I just try and narrow that a little bit. And it is going to be a case of trial and error. You really need to practice this in order to be able to get the selection that you want. And it won't be perfect. It will be very far from perfect, but it doesn't need to be at this case. Let's just bring that softness down on the highlight. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Now, don't worry that I've got this section here at the side selected and that sort of thing, and the hat. Again, I could spend more time sort of, trying to finesse this. I shall just spend a moment just doing that. just give you an opportunity just to have a play around with it. Again, make small changes. You don't want to make huge, big changes. You want to understand how the change that you're making is affecting the selection that you've got. Good. Okay, I think hopefully you've been given an opportunity to have a play around with that a little bit, as well as the actual selections. You've also got softness as well. So you've got softness that you can add, which just sort of, again, just gives you a little bit of fall off in the selection. But the main matte finesse controls are over here underneath the selection ranges here. And you've got a couple that are well worth looking at. So you've got clean black and clean white. So clean black will just sort of get, again, just sort of try and remove some of that speckling in the darker areas. Clean white does the same thing, so they can be useful to sort of help, you know, sort of fill in a matte, really. And also the blur radius is useful because we're not trying to, you know, perform a chroma key or something where we've got to have nice hard edges or anything like that. Instead, you know, we just need to get that matte to be as close to what we're after as possible. Okay. I think I'll go with that just for the moment. Again, you can spend quite a lot of time just sort of finessing this as much as possible. It's all about practice. Okay, there we go. Right. So now that we've made the selection, if we turn the highlight off, now we can go to whichever control that we want. So for example, if I go straight to the gamma control wheels, now again, if you've only got, you don't have the controls spread out across 3 palettes, you will need to click on the color wheels in order to access them. So you won't get them side by side. So you would make your selection first, then click over to the color wheels. And then if I take the gamma and just increase that, can you see how it's increasing the brightness of a face? Yes. But of course, it's also increasing the brightness of, you know, parts of the image that aren't in her face, but are part of that selection. Just add a touch brightness, try and brighten it up a little bit. So how can I limit that selection further? Well, I can actually combine the qualifiers and any other selection with a power window. Now for this, just make sure you're on the first frame of this shot. And if I select this node, I'll go to my power windows. Sorry, this is the power window, of course. So again, if you're in the case that you're looking at single panel of groups, you'll need to select the power window. For faces, we usually go with ovals. So again, here I'll select the circular power window, and now I'll just place that again, roughly over her face. You don't need to be 100% accurate. You're not trying to rotoscope this. In actual fact, trying to rotoscope it is absolutely the wrong thing to try and do, to be honest. But you can see just from the node there that what that's done is it's just limited the change that I've got into this, combined with the qualifier mask, the qualifier map that I've created. So if I go back to the highlight, you can now see that I've used the power window in order to be able to limit the overall area of effect of that. So if I need to, I can now go back to the qualifier and possibly even refine that further at this point. Now, of course, the problem with this is that I've actually pulled a key on the hue, saturation, and luminance of her skin. And thankfully, the brightness and the color of the shot doesn't change throughout. However, she does look over, and of course, once she does that, all of a sudden her eye goes outside of this area that I'm affecting, and you can see there I'm now losing part of her face and I'm picking up bits of the background. So this is the other magic that DaVinci Resolve has. Resolve actually has one of the most respected trackers in the industry, and you can use it in order to be able to track the power window through the image. You're not tracking the qualifier, you're tracking the power window. So in this case, we go to the tracker, and again, it looks like a little target. Again, if you've not got the 3 panels, then again, you'll find it over here on the left-hand side somewhere, but it looks like the little target. And here, the tracker is automatically set up to track windows, so power windows, and it will track pan, which is horizontally. It'll track tilt, which is vertically. It'll track zoom. So if it tracks some pixels that are moving aside from each other, that's a zoom. And it'll track rotation as well as any sort of twisting in 3D. Now, for the best results here, we don't want the zoom. We will use the zoom in a moment, but we're not going to use the zoom for this. So I'm going to uncheck zoom. So track zoom analysis is disabled. And then all I do is because I'm at the beginning of this clip, is I track forward. If I was at the end, I could track backwards. And sometimes you might want to put a power window in the middle of the shot, and you want to track forwards and backwards from that point. So you can do it wherever. So in this case, I'm going to track forward, and it does that. And those tiny little X's are all points at which Resolve is actually tracking the movement through the image. And you can see as I move that backwards and forwards now, you can see that that power window is firmly rooted to her face. And I can even just move it if I need to reframe slightly in order to pick out the rest of her face. And again, I'm just going to brighten her up a touch. I'm going to maybe use color boost on that as well. Just, oh, no, way too much there. A few points. Don't want to make her look as though she's sunburned. You get the idea. So that's tracking. And this is in a free piece of software. Just thought I'd get that in, you know. Okay, so we've got a power window over this combined with a qualifier. However, we can now start to divide the image up in lots of different ways. So a couple of little bits of fun here. If we add another serial node to this, let's call this node eyes. Eyes. Got a little bit of a missing bit in a forehead because I didn't get the matte quite right. So quite annoyed about that, but hey, never mind. Can't have everything, can you? Okay, back to eyes. So again, this is something that's often useful to be able to do. We want to create a shape around her eyes. So I am going to zoom in here, and I'm just going to move the image down slightly. So again, middle mouse click on this to be able to move the image down. And on this new node that I've just created, I'm going to create a new power window. Let's make that quite small, and I'm going to place it over her eyes. Probably seen something like this done previously. I'm going to increase the softness of that quite a bit. Something like that. Again, just want to make sure I've got her eyes all inside that that section. So now, of course, what I could do is I could lift her eyes a little bit. Yes. And using the mid-tone detail, remember, this allows me to soften or sharpen. But if I increase the mid-tone detail, I can actually just sharpen her eyes. Just sharpen the edges around her eyes. So again, it just gives a bit more definition to her eyes that she didn't have before. I don't go too far on that. Shift Z to bring that in. And now, of course, I do need to track that. You can see the camera is wobbling all over the place. You can see exactly what the camera movement is now that that power window isn't moving. So here we're going to go back to the tracker. This is where I do want the zoom back in. So I'm going to click on the zoom checkbox because she turns her head, her eyes aren't going to get further apart, but the perspective would make it look as though the eyes are getting further apart. So that's why I want the zoom to come in. Otherwise, it won't change the size of the shape. So if we use the track forward, and there we have our track. Let's choose the off here. And again, I made it quite noticeable so you could see that hopefully on the zoom. But hopefully yours is a little bit more subtle than mine. That's quite awful, really. Let me increase the softness at least of that. Let me get rid of that. Oh, well, no, she still looks a little bit like Robin, an inverted Robin, I should say. Yeah. Hopefully the point is made. Much better. Yeah. That's a bit better. It's taken the edge off that. Good. I think I've rescued it at least, or at least rescued my my dignity, if nothing else. Okay. Oh, my keyboard's lost its connection. There we go. Plug it in. There we go. We got it back anyway. Okay. So one last thing on this. I'm going to add a final serial node here. I'll put it into there. Let's just move all of these around so that I'm putting them in the right place. You can also make them a little smaller using this slider at the top, very similar to the media pool. So on this one, I'm going to call this vignette. And on this one, very simple, I'm just going to make a circular vignette. So turn on the power window there. I'm just going to use the controls here to adjust the size. So I'm just going to make it very, very big. Make it as big, 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 and move that off somewhere like that. Make it even bigger. Move that off to there. I can see from the thumbnail there that it's actually selecting inside the power window. So I'm just going to check that with the highlight. That's what I've got there. And I actually want to select outside that. So, I mean, I could add an outside node to it. Or the other thing that you can do is actually invert the actual power window itself. So you can't do inside and outside on the same node, but you can do one or the other. So here in the power window, you've got the circle, which is currently active, and this is your invert button. So invert means I'm now selecting the outside of the power window. So I'm now selecting that outside. And I can carry on grading this. I can adjust the gamma or the shadows or whatever I want to do. But something else that you can do is apply some open effects. So if I click on the open effects here, and you've got the Gaussian blur, and I need to find that node, and you need to apply the blur. You need to apply the effect to a node, and you can only have one effect per node. So if you need multiple effects from the open effects, you need multiple nodes on it. So again, Gaussian blur onto there. And then what I can do is I can then use that in order to blur this side of the image here. So you can see, I'll push it up a little bit in order to be able to blur that, just as it sort of disappears into the shadows. I believe in painting they call this chiaroscuro or something like that. I think somebody once told me. But there you go. There's me using fancy words that I don't understand once more. Cool. So that gives you at least something that you can hopefully start to play around with and start to think about how you might want to build up a grade by selecting various parts of the image and manipulating them in different ways. And the fact that you can combine these techniques together is also important. So the qualifier might be the first step, and then your power window might help just refine that selection a little bit more. So you don't need to be 100% accurate on it, but it does require work. So, it's not just something that you're going to be able to just, pick up and run with. Open effects are there, yes. So yeah, if you need open effects, you've got access to your open effects using that button there. And again, these are all of the open effects, very similar to what you've got on the edit page anyway. So you've got light and blurs, and you've also got some specialist color tools here as well. Same limitation about Resolve Studio versus the free one. Not all of the effects are available in the free version of Resolve. Good, excellent. Lots of questions coming in, so I'll just give you a moment just to let the guys clear some of those questions, if not necessarily all of them. Cool. Okay. Good. So that is lesson 10 in your book. Lesson 11 is a very, very quick lesson. What lesson 11 is just a few examples of creative looks that you have that you can sort of apply. Now, I mean, the thing with a subject like this is, you know, everyone's got their own particular ways of creating a particular look or feel. So, you know, there are various recipes and things like that that you can work with. It's all it all depends though on the initial balance that you do. And if you get the initial balance right, then the creating of the look effectively becomes almost copy and paste. Almost, not quite, but almost. So again, it's about getting the balance right before you can get into the sort of the creative side of things. Nevertheless, when we talk about creating looks, one of the things that you may be familiar with is the application of LUTs, LUTS, which stands for lookup tables. One of the things that you can do, well, two main ways in which you use LUTs is either what we call a technical LUT, and that is transferring the color space from, let's say, from a log color space into Rec 709. Well, that's kind of what Resolve is doing with its Resolve management anyway. So you can do it with LUTs if you want to. But the other way that we can use LUTs is as a creative way to be able to take something that's been balanced and then just push it, just twist it, just to give it a different feel, a different look, a different overall result that might be just slightly out of the ordinary. So that's what this chapter is about. It's very short. It gives us a couple of examples of things, but the main thing is just being able to use LUTs in Resolve. So be able to use custom LUTs and to be able to use some of the built-in LUTs that we've got. The problem with using LUTs is they're pretty dependent on making sure you've got the right one. So it's not just a case of kind of browsing through and looking for them. They're there for a specific reason. So that's what we need to make sure, first of all. There's also a quick little exercise here in making a black and white look, as well as creating a bleach bypass look, but then also being able to save grades and make them available across different projects. This is using something that we refer to as power grades. So we shall take a look at this very, very quickly. Oops. Try again, Chris. There we go. That's it. So we're going to use the same project, but we're going to use a different timeline for this, just to explore some of these little subjects. And the main thing that we want to do here is actually remove the Resolve color management. If we turn off the Resolve color management for this project, then all of the grading that we've just done is kind of going to be undone. So rather than just simply turn off Resolve color management for this project, what I'm going to ask you to do is save the project as another version. So could you go to the File menu, first of all, please? Choose Save Project As. Call this Wyoming Cattle Ranch, and then we'll just call it Lesson 11. And then choose to save. So now you'll see I'm now working on a version of this project. And if I just go to the project manager, you'll see I've got Wyoming Cattle Ranch and Wyoming Cattle Ranch Lesson 11, and this is the one that's open. Now I'll go to the project settings. So click on the cog symbol down in the bottom right hand corner. We'll go to color management. And then from the color science menu, just simply choose DaVinci Y RGB and then save. So color science, turn it back to DaVinci Y RGB and then click save. And you've seen the results straight away. You've still got the grade, but because you've not got that base color management change going on, then the result is completely different, because you don't have the necessary information from which to build that grade on. So this goes to show some of the, what the color management is doing. Could you go from the timeline pop-up menu, could you go to the creative looks timeline, please? And we've got 3 shots in this timeline. I'll let you have a quick browse through them. There's our green threshing machine again, and we've also got this fella standing here. And so the first thing we want to do here is, because we don't have the resolve color management on, which would give us that sort of normalized starting point, is we can manually apply this using a LUT. As I said before, LUTs come in sort of 2 main flavors. They come in as a sort of, they come in as a technical LUT. So in this case, it would take us through from this HDR and actually change the color space from HDR into Rec 709, which is what this project is all set to. So that's the first thing. The second thing a LUT can do is actually be used as what we call a creative LUT. So it gives you a particular look or a particular feel. Lots of people think of them as effects. They're not. Again, it's all based on the idea that your initial color balance is correct, and then it interprets that color space and those pixels into the result that you're looking for. If you don't have it correct, then the result that you get won't be correct. So they're quite specific in this. You've got some built-in LUTs already in Resolve. So if you click on the LUTs browser at the top of the color page, the LUTs browser is divided into all sorts of different cameras and particular looks and things like that. So again, Blackmagic Design cameras, and you can see that there's various different things to Rec 709. But in this case, if you go to HDR ST 2084, and if you scroll down through this list of LUTs, the first one that's available to you is HDR 1000 nits to gamma 2.4. So what this is it's actually taking something that's at this HDR level and actually converting it, doing the mathematics to get it into the Rec 709 gamma 2.4 color space, which in this case is what the Resolve color management was doing, but we're now just doing it as LUTs. So in this case, again, you can see how I go from the very flat image, and just if I just preview that, just how it actually adjusts the overall contrast and color balance there of that shot. So again, it's quite specific to the type of material that you've shot. Right click on that and then choose Apply LUT to Current Node. And that will apply that LUT to that node. So now that shot has been balanced with a technical LUT. You can, of course, do further balancing. So you can adjust it afterwards. You can add serial nodes after that, but this gives you your sort of base. So we're going to add a new node to this. So Option S to add a, sorry, that was Control S. Option S or Alt S to add a second node. We're going to call this first one. Let's rename that LUT, and let's rename the second one to Look. So what we have with this is technical LUTs are available within Resolve, as you've just seen. But if you're looking for a particular result now, then what you will need is you may need another LUT, a creative LUT, to give you a particular look or a particular feel. There's lots of ways that you can get those LUTs. You can download them to your heart's content from the internet. I once had somebody tell me with great pride that they had 10,000 LUTs on their system. Good luck with that in terms of finding the one that you actually want to use. But in all seriousness, there might be ways in which you want to create your own LUTs in order to mimic a particular look or a particular feel. You can use graphics applications to create LUTs, and you can actually use those LUTs directly in Resolve. You can also use Resolve to create LUTs, and this is particularly useful if you actually want to hand out a particular LUT for a particular set of footage to a group of editors in order for them to be able to apply it, or a group of colorists to be able to apply it to give you a particular look and feel to a range of footage. We've actually got a custom LUT. If I just go into my Finder and open up a Finder window here, if I go to my desktop, there we go to my desktop here. It's actually in the beginner's guide lesson 11 folder, and you'll actually see there's a lesson 11 day for night LUT. So this will take something that's been balanced and actually apply a set of preset prescriptive changes that will actually give me the result that I'm looking for. So it's a .cube file. Now, I can't just simply drag and drop that into Resolve. I actually need Resolve to be able to load it and use it. So a way in which we can do that is in Resolve itself. If you click on the Resolve menu and choose Preferences, and in the System menu, choose the General category. And here it says, well, I can actually specify some LUT locations. So if we click Add, select Desktop, and then select your Beginner's Guide Lessons folder. You could go in and choose Lesson 11, but actually it will recognize the LUTs that are in there. So if you've got a whole folder full of other folders full of LUTs, then it's easy to select the top level of that. Let's choose Open and then Save. Now, nothing ultimately has changed. So what we have to do here is we have to right click in the LUTs browser and just choose Refresh. And you should now see the containing folder where that LUT is. So lesson 11. And there is your day for night LUT. So I can just simply make sure I've got node 2 selected, right click and apply LUT to current node. And I've now got my day for night particular shot. And of course, night is always blue in movies. It's always black when I'm looking, but it's always blue in movies, yes. Of course, that only works if I've got that LUT on. If I disable that, I get a much different result if I disable the first LUT. So yeah, that's one particular use of the LUT. Let's look at another use of a sort of creative effect. I'm going to copy this first clip because I want the grade from that. Particularly, I want the first LUT that's in there, because when I select clip 2, that of course is a flat clip. So I'm going to paste, Command V, Control V to paste that in. I've now got my day for night shot on there, of course. So I've pasted the entire grade. But I don't want the day for night shot. So I'm just going to right click on the second node here and choose Reset Node. And I'm just going to change the name of that as well to black and white. So one of the things that we may need to do at some point within our careers is create a black and white version of the scene or the film, the shot for whatever reasons. And one might think, oh, well, black and white is just simply an absence of color. Let's just desaturate. Not quite that straightforward, or that's one way of approaching it. Another way is if I select this second node, this black and white node, and I want to come down here to a set of controls called the RGB mixer. The RGB mixer. So this is 2 to the right of our standard color wheels, sets of controls that we've been using. So RGB mixer. And this allows me to, surprise, surprise, mix the red, green, and blue channels together. But down at the bottom here, there's an option for monochrome. And that makes it black and white, monochrome. But we've still got access to the red, green, and blue input channels. And these can actually have a marked effect on the overall result of our monochrome. So here, for example, if I increase the blue output, watch the sky. I increase the blue output. Can you see the sky becomes much brighter because the blue output has been increased? If I decrease that, then the sky becomes darker. So I've still got a little bit of grading control even within this desaturated look. The green, there you can see I can directly affect the green of my threshing machine. So I'm gonna maybe do something like that, and maybe just turn down the red. Turn up the red. Look at that. There we go. It doesn't matter at this stage what we're doing. It's just a matter of the fact that we've got creative control over this. Of course, the other thing I've stopped talking about is, of course, my scopes, but that tends to be how they work here. One more very quick example then, in this case, is if I select the third clip, and again, Command V to paste the grade from the first clip. I don't want to do a day for night shot on this. So in this case, again, I'm going to reset that node. And then in this case, I'm going to change it to bleach bypass. So bleach bypass is a process that was developed in film. When you develop film, I think you leave the silver on it or something. So it creates this sort of very sort of contrasty, low saturation effect. And so it's one of the things that's most often mimicked by people who want to create a particular look. You can often do this with LUTs in yourself. You can actually get hold of LUTs for it, or you can create it yourself rather easily. There's lots of different ways of doing it. This is just one simple way of being able to do it. So if I select this node here, I'm just going to go straight to my custom curves. And I'm going to select the Y luminance channel for this. And again, just gonna maybe just adjust. Yeah, that'll do for this. There we go. So the first thing I want to do is introduce that S curve that we talked about before. So here in this case, I'm going to add a point here, and I'm going to add a point probably about there. And if I increase that, this creates a very sort of stylized, quite harsh contrast effect. Push it a little bit so you can see we're getting that very sort of contrast. If we go with the, we're going to put a little bit of a sort of a tealy, sort of greeny blue in the shadows here. So if I go to the blue color channel here, and I'm going to add a point probably in this section here where I've got the most of the color there. So I'll add one probably about here, about 2/5 of the way through the curve. And I'm just going to add a little bit of blue into the shadow. So I'm going to cool the shadows off so you can see a little bit of blue being introduced there to the shadow. Not a huge amount, but enough just to give it a little twist. Again, I'm going to do the same with the green, pretty much in the same places, and add a little bit of green into that. And you can see these points here just hold the rest of the curve in place. So I'm just limiting the increase in the blue and the green into the shadowy areas of this. So it gives me a bit of a tealy sort of feel to the shadows. And last thing I'm going to do on this is if I head back to my color wheels, and down here I've got access to my saturation. I'm just going to bring the saturation down probably to around about, maybe about there. So about 35, 36, 40, something like that. Obviously I'm removing the color, but I don't want to remove all of the color. But this is one example possibly about how you could do that sort of bleach bypass, that sort of very high contrasty, slightly, sort of gritty, kind of not quite Saving Private Ryan, but, kind of like Walking Dead type things. There we go. So just a couple of examples there of some creative looks. Again, it's all built on this idea of a balanced shot that you can then do further work on. So this isn't just simply applying an effect to a clip. This is actually balancing it and then twisting it further. Just to wrap up, and look at that, showing we are 1 minute off our finishing time, but just to wrap up very quickly, if you actually want to use these grades that you've created, maybe you want to use them in another project, for example, then what you can do is if you go back to the gallery here, you can actually open the list of galleries that you've got using this sidebar here, using this little menu just on the right of the galleries window. And you can see that you've got these sort of albums. You've got stills, and you've also got something called power grades. Power grades are grades that are then available for other projects within the same database. So this means that if you've got this grade that you want to use within one project in another, then what you can do here is if I grab a still of that, and again, I will change the label, so we'll call it bleach bypass. I can actually then take that and I can move it into my power grades. There we go. And I've now got that, and now I can open up another project and apply that power grade, apply that grade from the power grades into that project, and it will bring the information across. One other thing that you can do is, if you want to, you've got a grade that you actually want to share with people, the other thing that you can do is export a LUT. And exporting a LUT is very straightforward in Resolve. You could just simply right click on the thumbnail and you choose Generate LUT. The 33-point LUT's probably the most compatible. The more points you've got, the more fidelity that there is to the final result. But usually 33 point is more than enough for most people. And you can just export that to anywhere on your system. So if I just put that on the desktop, and I'll call it bleach bypass, and save that, you now see I've got a 3D LUT there on the desktop, which I can email around or bring back into Resolve to be able to use. The advantage of that is that all of the grading is done. the base shot right, of course. So that's part of the work, but I don't gain access to the individual controls. So it's not like applying a grade. You are applying something that has a bunch of mathematical settings in it that's all self-contained. You can't just go in and start to pick and choose the bits that you want to use. Also, not everything that you can change about an image in Resolve is supported by LUT. So basically, it's anything to do with the general color wheels or the curves, but it does not include things like power windows, tracking, qualifiers. I don't think are included either. Might just need to check that, but certainly power windows and tracking aren't. But curves and color wheels are. They're all supported, and you can save those in a LUT. Only 3 minutes past the deadline tonight, this morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. Okay, good. Great. Thank you very much. As always, I hope you've enjoyed the session, first of all. And as always, we'll just hang around for a few minutes after this, just to make sure if anyone's got any questions or anything, just put them in the Q&A. Other than that, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have found this useful. I hope you found it enjoyable. It's probably one of the most fun sessions that we run. It's one of those things that sort of gives you real insight, hopefully, into what Resolve can do from a colouring point of view and a grading point of view. So thanks very much. I shall leave you with a little bit of music just for the next few minutes, and barring natural catastrophes or anything else, I shall see you back here same time tomorrow, where we'll be having session 4, and we'll be talking about Fairlight and Fusion. So the double Fs, Fairlight and Fusion. So thanks very much for joining us. Speak to you tomorrow.